By the dawn of the 3rd century BCE, two formidable powers dominated the Mediterranean world, each representing fundamentally different approaches to empire building and governance. Rome, the ambitious city-state that had methodically conquered the Italian peninsula, stood poised to expand beyond its traditional boundaries. Across the sea, Carthage commanded vast commercial networks and territorial holdings that stretched from the Atlantic coasts of Morocco to the islands of Sicily and Sardinia. These two civilizations, though sharing certain cultural influences from the Greek world, had developed along markedly different trajectories that would ultimately bring them into catastrophic conflict. Rome's transformation from a modest city-state along the Tiber River into the dominant force of the Italian peninsula represents one of history's most remarkable examples of systematic territorial expansion. The process had begun centuries earlier, but by 264 BCE, Roman control extended from the Po Valley in the north to the Greek cities of southern Italy. This expansion had not occurred through random conquest or opportunistic raiding, but through a carefully orchestrated system of alliances, military campaigns, and political integration that would become the foundation of Roman imperial administration. The Roman Confederation system emerged as the ingenious solution to governing diverse populations across the peninsula. Rather than imposing uniform rule over conquered territories, Rome created a complex hierarchy of relationships that bound Italian communities to the Roman state, while allowing them to maintain certain local autonomies. At the apex of this system stood Roman citizens, who enjoyed full legal rights and political participation. Below them were the Latin allies, communities that had been granted Latin rights, including the ability to conduct legal business with Romans and the potential path to full citizenship. The Italian allies, or socii, formed the largest group within the Confederation, maintaining their local governments and customs while providing military service to Rome in exchange for protection and a share in the spoils of war. This confederation system proved remarkably effective at mobilizing resources and manpower. When Rome called upon its allies for military service, the response was swift and substantial. The Formula Tugitorum, a military census conducted regularly, revealed that Rome could field armies totaling over 700,000 infantry and 70,000 cavalry from the Confederation's combined populations. This represented an unprecedented concentration of military potential in the ancient world, made possible by Rome's policy of integration rather than mere subjugation. The physical infrastructure supporting this confederation reflected Roman engineering prowess and administrative foresight. A network of roads, including the famous Appian Way completed in 312 BCE, connected Roman territories and facilitated rapid movement of troops, officials, and commercial goods. These roads, built to exacting standards with deep foundations and carefully graded surfaces, could accommodate heavy military traffic in all weather conditions. Alongside the roads, Rome established colonies throughout the peninsula, serving as both strategic strongpoints and centres of Roman culture that gradually spread Latin language and customs among the Italian populations. Roman military organisation by the 3rd century BCE had evolved into the manipular system, a flexible formation that proved superior to the traditional phalanx in the varied terrain of the Italian peninsula. The legion, typically numbering around 4,200 men, was divided into 120 maniples arranged in 3 lines: hastati in front, principes in the middle, and triarii at the rear. Each maniple operated as an independent tactical unit, capable of manoeuvring around obstacles and adapting to local battlefield conditions. The Roman soldier, or legionnaire, was a citizen farmer who served for fixed campaigns, bringing his own equipment and maintaining strong ties to his community. This citizen soldier tradition created armies with exceptional morale and discipline, as soldiers fought not merely for pay, but for their families, land, and the glory of Rome. The Roman economy that supported this military machine was fundamentally agricultural, based on the labour of free farmers working small holdings throughout the peninsula. The ager publicus, or public land seized from defeated enemies, was distributed to Roman citizens and allies, creating a broad base of property-owning soldiers with personal stakes in Roman success. This agricultural foundation provided not only the manpower for Roman armies, but also the food supplies necessary to sustain lengthy campaigns. Roman farms produced wheat, barley, olives, and grapes, while pastoral activities provided meat, leather, and wool for military equipment. Across the Mediterranean, Carthage had developed along entirely different lines, creating a maritime empire that controlled the sea lanes of the western Mediterranean and established trading posts from Spain to the Levant. Founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre in the 9th century BCE, Carthage had inherited the seafaring traditions and commercial expertise of its mother city. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthaginian merchants operated throughout the Mediterranean, their distinctive purple-sailed ships carrying precious metals from Spanish mines, African ivory and exotic animals, manufactured goods from Carthaginian workshops, and agricultural products from the fertile lands of Tunisia. The Carthaginian Empire was structured around commercial exploitation rather than territorial integration. Unlike Rome's confederation system, which sought to incorporate conquered peoples into a unified political structure, Carthage maintained a network of trading posts, allied cities, and tribute-paying territories bound together by commercial relationships and naval power. The city of Carthage itself, with its magnificent harbours and imposing walls, served as the nexus of this far-flung network. The circular military harbour, capable of housing 220 warships, and the adjacent commercial harbour demonstrated Carthage's priorities: naval supremacy and commercial prosperity. Carthaginian territorial holdings reflected this commercial focus. In North Africa, Carthage controlled the fertile coastal regions from modern-day Tunisia to Morocco, extracting tribute from Berber tribes and maintaining agricultural states worked by slave labour. These territories provided grain, olive oil, and other agricultural products that sustained Carthage's urban population and supplied its trading expeditions. In Spain, Carthaginian control centred on the silver mines of the Sierra Morena and the fertile valleys of Andalusia, where Carthaginian families like the Barcids established virtual kingdoms that generated enormous wealth for the home city. The islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica represented crucial strategic positions in Carthage's maritime empire. Western Sicily, with its Carthaginian cities of Panormus, Lilybaeum, and Drepana, controlled the sea routes between Africa and Italy. Sardinia's mineral wealth and strategic position made it another vital component of Carthaginian power, while Corsica provided naval bases for operations in the northern Mediterranean. These island territories were governed directly by Carthaginian officials and garrisoned by professional troops, reflecting their importance to Carthaginian security. The Carthaginian military system differed fundamentally from Rome's citizen-soldier model. Carthage relied heavily on mercenary forces recruited from across the Mediterranean world, supplemented by contingents from allied cities and tributary peoples. These mercenary armies included Iberian infantry renowned for their skill with sword and javelin, Gallic warriors from southern France known for their fierce charges, Berber cavalry from North Africa, and specialised troops like Balearic slingers whose accuracy with stone projectiles was legendary throughout the ancient world. The core of Carthaginian armies consisted of the Sacred Band, elite infantry recruited from Carthaginian citizens and equipped with the finest weapons and armour. This reliance on mercenaries provided Carthage with immediate access to skilled professional soldiers without depleting its own citizen population, but it also created significant vulnerabilities. Mercenary loyalty depended on regular pay and successful campaigns, making Carthaginian armies susceptible to mutiny during financial difficulties or military setbacks. The diverse composition of Carthaginian forces, while providing tactical flexibility, also created command challenges as officers struggled to coordinate troops speaking different languages and following different military traditions. Carthaginian naval power represented the empire's greatest strength and the foundation of its commercial dominance. The Carthaginian fleet consisted of hundreds of warships, primarily quinquemes, vessels with 5 banks of oars that provided the speed and maneuverability necessary for Mediterranean naval warfare. These ships, constructed in the naval yards of Carthage using techniques perfected over centuries, were crewed by skilled sailors recruited from throughout the Carthaginian Empire. The Carthaginian navy's tactical doctrine emphasized ramming attacks, using bronze-reinforced prows to hull enemy vessels, and boarding actions led by marines equipped for close combat. The economic foundations of Carthaginian power rested on commercial networks that spanned the known world. Carthaginian merchants maintained trading relationships with peoples from Britain to the Black Sea, exchanging manufactured goods for raw materials and luxury items. The famous Carthaginian expeditions beyond the Pillars of Hercules, including Hanno's voyage down the African coast and Himilco's exploration of the Atlantic European shores, demonstrated the scope of Carthaginian commercial ambitions. These trading networks generated enormous wealth that flowed back to Carthage, funding the city's magnificent public buildings, supporting its large population, and financing the mercenary armies that protected Carthaginian interests. The contrast between Roman and Carthaginian approaches to wealth generation reflected deeper cultural differences. Rome's agricultural economy created a society of citizen farmers who viewed military service as a civic duty and territorial expansion as a means of acquiring land for distribution to deserving citizens. Carthaginian commercial culture, by contrast, emphasized profit maximization and market control, viewing military force as a tool for protecting trade routes and commercial interests rather than as an instrument of territorial conquest for its own sake. These fundamental differences in military organization, economic structure, and imperial administration would prove crucial in the coming conflicts. Rome's citizen-soldier legions, fighting for their homes and families, would demonstrate remarkable resilience and determination, even in the face of devastating defeats. Carthage's professional mercenary armies, while initially superior in training and equipment, would prove vulnerable to the extended campaigns and resource warfare that characterized the Punic Wars. The stage was thus set for a confrontation between 2 radically different approaches to power and empire in the ancient world. Rome's land-based confederation system, with its emphasis on political integration and citizen participation, would clash with Carthage's maritime commercial empire, built on professional military forces and economic exploitation. The outcome of this struggle would determine not only the fate of these 2 great powers, but the future course of Mediterranean civilization itself. The spark that ignited the first great conflict between Rome and Carthage came from an unlikely source: a band of Italian mercenaries who had seized control of the strategic city of Messana on the northeastern tip of Sicily. These men, calling themselves the Mamertinens after Mammers, the Oscan god of war, had originally served under Agathocles, the ambitious tyrant of Syracuse. Following Agathocles' death in 289 BCE, the Mamertines had marched north and through treachery captured Messana, establishing themselves as the city's new rulers. For nearly 2 decades, they had maintained their precarious position through raids against neighbouring territories and alliances with various Sicilian powers. The Mamertine situation became critical when Hero II of Syracuse, seeking to consolidate his control over eastern Sicily, launched a determined campaign to expel these mercenaries from their stronghold. The Syracusan forces, well-trained and numerous, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Mamertines at the Longanus River around 265 BCE. Faced with the prospect of complete annihilation, the desperate Mamertines found themselves with no choice but to seek external assistance. However, their appeal for help would split their own ranks and ultimately draw the two greatest powers of the Western Mediterranean into direct confrontation. One faction among the Mamertines favoured seeking aid from Carthage, whose naval forces regularly patrolled the waters around Sicily and maintained garrisons in the western portions of the island. The Carthaginians, recognising the strategic importance of Messana's position, controlling the narrow strait between Sicily and Italy, responded favourably to this appeal. A Carthaginian garrison under the command of Hanno quickly occupied the city's citadel, effectively placing Messana under Carthaginian protection. This move followed established Carthaginian policy of preventing any single power from dominating Sicily, as such control would threaten their own territorial holdings and commercial interests on the island. The opposing Mamertine faction, however, had simultaneously dispatched envoys to Rome, appealing for assistance against both Syracuse and their new Carthaginian protectors. This appeal placed the Roman Senate in an extraordinarily difficult position. Rome had recently concluded a treaty with Carthage that explicitly recognised respective spheres of influence, and direct intervention in Sicily would constitute a clear violation of these agreements. Moreover, assisting a band of mercenaries who had seized a city through treachery hardly aligned with Roman concepts of honour and justice. The debate within the Roman Senate proved intense and prolonged. Many senators, including the influential Appius Claudius Caudex, argued that Rome could not permit Carthage to establish a foothold so close to the Italian mainland. The Strait of Messana, they contended, was barely 3 miles wide at its narrowest point, and Carthaginian control of this passage would effectively give them the ability to threaten Roman shipping and potentially launch invasions of southern Italy. The strategic implications were clear. If Carthage controlled both sides of the strait, they could strangle Roman access to Sicily and establish a permanent military presence within sight of the Italian coast. Other senators, led by more conservative voices, warned against the consequences of breaking treaties and engaging in what would inevitably become a major war. They pointed out that Rome had no naval forces capable of challenging Carthaginian supremacy at sea, and that any military intervention in Sicily would require the development of entirely new military capabilities. The financial costs alone would be enormous, and the outcome remained highly uncertain given Carthage's established presence on the island and their superior naval technology. The decision ultimately went to the popular assemblies, where the prospect of rich booty from Sicilian campaigns and the fear of Carthaginian encroachment on Italy proved decisive. The Roman people voted to accept the Mamertine appeal and authorised military intervention in Sicily. This decision, made in 264 BCE, would prove to be one of the most momentous in Roman history, marking the beginning of Rome's transformation from a regional Italian power into a Mediterranean empire. The Roman response came swiftly and decisively. Appius Claudius Caudex, now serving as consul, was assigned command of the expeditionary force tasked with crossing to Sicily. The initial challenge proved formidable: how to transport a Roman army across the strait when Carthaginian naval forces controlled the surrounding waters. The Romans solved this problem through a combination of diplomacy and deception, negotiating with local ship captains and using the cover of darkness to ferry advance forces across the narrow channel. The first Roman troops to land in Sicily numbered approximately 16,000 men, including 2 legions and their allied contingents. These forces represented the cream of Roman military capability, equipped with the standardized weapons and armor that had proven so effective in the Italian campaigns. Each legionnaire carried a gladius, the short stabbing sword that excelled in close combat, a pilum or heavy javelin designed to penetrate enemy shields, and a scutum, the distinctive rectangular shield that provided excellent protection while maintaining mobility. The Carthaginian response to the Roman landing revealed both the strengths and limitations of their military system. The Carthaginian commander in Sicily, Hanno, commanded a diverse force that included Carthaginian citizens, Sicilian allies, and mercenary contingents from across the Mediterranean. However, the sudden appearance of Roman forces caught the Carthaginians unprepared, and their initial attempts to prevent the Roman consolidation of their beachhead proved unsuccessful. The first major engagement occurred when Appius Claudius advanced against the combined forces of Carthage and Syracuse, who had temporarily set aside their differences to face the Roman threat. The battle demonstrated the tactical superiority of Roman military organisation over the more loosely coordinated Carthaginian and Syracusan forces. The Roman manipular system allowed for flexible response to enemy movements, while the discipline and training of the legionnaires proved decisive in close combat situations. Following this initial success, the Romans moved quickly to exploit their advantage. Hero II of Syracuse, recognizing the changing balance of power and the potential benefits of Roman alliance, abandoned his Carthaginian partners and negotiated a separate peace with Rome. This defection proved crucial, as it provided the Romans with a reliable ally possessing detailed knowledge of Sicilian geography and politics, as well as access to Syracusan resources and naval facilities. The war's character changed dramatically as both sides committed increasing resources to the Sicilian theatre. The Romans established permanent bases on the island and began systematic campaigns to capture Carthaginian strongholds. The Carthaginians, meanwhile, reinforced their garrisons and adopted a defensive strategy designed to hold their key positions while using their naval superiority to disrupt Roman supply lines and communications with Italy. The prolonged nature of the conflict soon revealed a fundamental Roman weakness: their complete lack of naval capability. Carthaginian warships regularly intercepted Roman supply convoys, captured merchant vessels carrying provisions to Roman forces, and launched raids against Roman positions along the coast. The Romans found themselves fighting a war in which their enemy controlled the seas, limiting their ability to fully exploit their military advantages on land. The Roman decision to construct a navy represented one of the most ambitious undertakings in ancient military history. The Romans had virtually no experience with naval warfare, lacking both the technical knowledge to build warships and the seamanship skills necessary to operate them effectively. According to Polybius, the Romans solved the first problem by capturing a Carthaginian quinquereme that had run aground, using it as a model for their own shipbuilding efforts. The construction of the Roman fleet proceeded with characteristic Roman efficiency and determination. Shipyards were established along the Italian coast, and skilled craftsmen were recruited from Greek cities in southern Italy, where naval traditions remained strong. The Romans standardized their ship designs based on the captured Carthaginian vessel, focusing on the quinquereme as their primary warship type. These vessels, approximately 120 feet in length and powered by 300 oarsmen arranged in 5 banks, represented the cutting edge of ancient naval technology. While the ships were under construction, the Romans addressed the equally challenging problem of training crews. Rowing benches were constructed on land, allowing potential oarsmen to practice their techniques before ever setting foot on an actual vessel. Naval tactics were studied and adapted from Greek and Carthaginian practices, with Roman commanders working to develop strategies that would compensate for their inexperience at sea. The Romans' most significant naval innovation was the corvus, a boarding device that revolutionized ancient naval warfare. This mechanism consisted of a narrow gangway approximately 36 feet long and 4 feet wide, equipped with a heavy spike at its end. The corvus was mounted on a pivot at the front of Roman warships, allowing it to be swung around and dropped onto enemy vessels during close combat. When the spike penetrated the enemy deck, it created a stable bridge that allowed Roman marines to board and capture opposing ships. The corvus represented a brilliant adaptation of Roman military strengths to naval warfare. Rather than attempting to match Carthaginian expertise in traditional naval tactics like ramming and maneuvering, the Romans transformed sea battles into land battles fought on ship decks. Roman marines, trained in the close-quarters combat techniques that had proven so effective in Italian campaigns, could now bring their superior fighting skills to bear in naval engagements. The first major test of Roman naval capabilities came at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE. The Roman fleet, commanded by consul Gaius Duilius, encountered a Carthaginian squadron under Hannibal Gisco near the northeastern coast of Sicily. The Carthaginian commander, confident in his force's superior seamanship and naval experience, advanced to attack the Roman fleet in traditional fashion. The battle began with the Carthaginians attempting to ram the Roman vessels, a tactic that had proven effective against other Mediterranean navies. However, the Corvus devices proved devastatingly effective against these traditional approaches. As Carthaginian ships closed for ramming attacks, the Romans dropped their boarding bridges, trapping the enemy vessels and allowing Roman marines to swarm aboard. The superior training and equipment of Roman infantry quickly overwhelmed the Carthaginian crews, who were unprepared for this type of combat. The Roman victory at Mylae was comprehensive and shocking. The Carthaginians lost approximately 50 ships, including 31 captured vessels that were incorporated into the expanding Roman fleet. Hannibal Gisco himself was captured, along with thousands of Carthaginian sailors and marines. The psychological impact of this defeat reverberated throughout the Carthaginian Empire, as their previously unquestioned naval supremacy had been shattered by a people who had barely possessed a navy months earlier. The success at Mylae transformed Roman strategic thinking about the war. No longer content to fight a defensive campaign in Sicily, Roman leaders began planning ambitious operations that would carry the war directly to Carthaginian territory. The Roman Senate authorized the construction of additional fleets and the recruitment of larger armies, signalling their intention to pursue total victory rather than a negotiated settlement. The expanded Roman naval capabilities enabled increasingly bold operations throughout the Mediterranean. Roman fleets began raiding Carthaginian territories in Sardinia and Corsica, disrupting the commercial networks that sustained Carthaginian power. These operations, while not decisive in themselves, demonstrated Rome's growing confidence and capability in naval warfare. The war's momentum shifted decisively in Rome's favour, following their victory at the massive naval battle of Ecnomus in 256 BCE. The Romans assembled their largest fleet to date, consisting of approximately 330 warships carrying 140,000 men, for an ambitious invasion of North Africa. The Carthaginians, recognizing the threat to their homeland, assembled a comparable force to intercept the Roman expedition. The Battle of Ecnomus became the largest naval engagement in ancient history, with over 600 warships and nearly 300,000 men participating in the conflict. The Romans arranged their fleet in a wedge formation, with the strongest squadrons at the point designed to break through Carthaginian lines. The Carthaginians, commanded by Hamilcar and Hanno, attempted to use their superior maneuverability to outflank the Roman formation and attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The battle raged for hours across the waters south of Sicily, with individual ship duels occurring throughout the massive engagement area. The Corvus devices again proved decisive, allowing Roman marines to capture ship after ship once the boarding bridges locked the vessels together. The Carthaginian defeat was even more catastrophic than at Mylae, with over 90 ships lost and thousands of experienced sailors killed or captured. The Roman victory at Ecnomus opened the sea lanes to North Africa and enabled the landing of a substantial Roman army under Marcus Atilius Regulus near the city of Clupea. This invasion force, numbering approximately 40,000 men, represented the first time Roman legions had operated outside of Italy and Sicily. The initial Roman successes in North Africa were remarkable, with several Carthaginian cities surrendering and large portions of the countryside falling under Roman control. However, the African campaign ultimately demonstrated the limitations of Roman strategic thinking and the resilience of Carthaginian power. The Romans failed to press their advantage quickly enough, allowing Carthage time to reorganize its defences and recruit new forces. The arrival of Spartan general Xanthippus, who reorganized the Carthaginian army and introduced more effective tactical formations, marked the beginning of Roman difficulties in North Africa. The destruction of Regulus's army in 255 BCE and the subsequent naval disasters that befell Roman rescue fleets highlighted the enormous challenges of sustaining military operations across the Mediterranean. The Romans lost hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men in storms and battles, forcing them to reconsider their strategic approach to the war. The conflict's focus returned to Sicily, where both sides settled into a prolonged struggle for control of key fortified positions. The siege of Lilybaeum, Carthage's principal stronghold in western Sicily, became the defining campaign of the war's later phases. This massive fortress, protected by strong walls and supplied by sea, represented the key to Carthaginian control of Sicily. The Roman siege of Lilybaeum, beginning in 250 BCE, demonstrated both the evolution of Roman military capabilities and the stubborn resistance of Carthaginian defenders. The Romans constructed elaborate siege works, including massive earthen ramps and siege towers designed to overtop the city's walls. The defenders, commanded by Hamilco, employed every available defensive technique, including the use of fire ships against Roman naval forces and sorties designed to destroy Roman siege equipment. The siege dragged on for years, with neither side able to achieve decisive advantage. The Romans gradually tightened their grip on the city, but Carthaginian naval forces continued to supply the garrison and reinforce the defenders. The prolonged nature of the siege strained Roman resources and tested the endurance of their military system. The final phase of the war was determined by Rome's ability to achieve naval supremacy through the construction of yet another fleet. The Roman treasury, depleted by decades of warfare, could not finance this final naval effort. Instead, wealthy Roman citizens voluntarily contributed funds for ship construction, demonstrating the depth of Roman commitment to victory. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE, where the Roman fleet under Gaius Lutatius Catulus encountered the Carthaginian relief force attempting to supply Lilybaeum. The Romans had learned from their previous naval experiences, improving their ship designs and crew training. The battle resulted in a crushing Roman victory, with the Carthaginian fleet losing approximately 120 ships and its commander Hanno captured. This final naval defeat left Carthage unable to continue the war. The Carthaginian government, facing financial exhaustion and the prospect of Roman invasion of North Africa, authorized Hamilcar Barca to negotiate peace terms. The resulting Treaty of Lutatius imposed harsh conditions on Carthage: complete evacuation of Sicily, payment of 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, and agreement not to attack Syracuse or Rome's other allies. The First Punic War's conclusion marked a fundamental shift in Mediterranean power relationships. Rome had transformed itself from a land-based Italian confederation into a naval power capable of projecting force across the sea. The acquisition of Sicily as Rome's first overseas province established precedents for imperial administration that would shape centuries of Roman expansion. For Carthage, the loss of Sicily and the crushing financial burden of the war indemnity created the conditions for internal instability and the rise of new leadership that would seek revenge against Rome. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Lutatius had barely been ratified when Carthage found itself facing an existential crisis that would dwarf even the devastation of the First Punic War. The massive indemnity payments to Rome, combined with the loss of Sicily's revenues, had left the Carthaginian treasury virtually empty. The government's immediate response was to drastically reduce military expenditures, beginning with the dismissal of the mercenary armies that had fought so long in Sicily. This decision, driven by financial necessity, would unleash a catastrophe that nearly destroyed Carthage from within. The mercenary forces that had served Carthage during the Sicilian campaigns represented a diverse collection of professional soldiers drawn from across the Mediterranean world. Spanish infantry, renowned for their skill with the falcator's sword and their distinctive white tunics with purple borders, had formed the backbone of many Carthaginian armies. Gallic warriors from southern France, identifiable by their long shields and iron-tipped spears, had provided shock troops for crucial battles. Berber cavalry from the Atlas Mountains, masters of hit-and-run tactics on their hardy desert horses, had dominated the reconnaissance and pursuit phases of campaigns. Balearic slingers, capable of hurling lead bullets with lethal accuracy at ranges exceeding 200 yards, had served as specialized support troops whose skills were unmatched in the ancient world. These men had fought for Carthage for years, enduring the hardships of siege warfare and the brutal realities of ancient combat. Many had served continuously since the war's early phases, developing strong bonds with their comrades and accumulating substantial back pay that the Carthaginian government had promised to settle upon the war's conclusion. The sudden dismissal of these forces, without the promised payments, created a powder keg of resentment that would soon explode into open rebellion. The immediate catalyst for revolt came when the Carthaginian government attempted to transport the dismissed mercenaries to North Africa for final payment and dispersal. Rather than settling accounts in Sicily, where the soldiers had ready access to ships and could return to their homelands, the Carthaginians insisted on bringing the entire force to Carthage itself. This decision reflected both financial constraints and security concerns, as the government hoped to negotiate reduced payments and prevent the mercenaries from remaining in Sicily as potential threats to the peace settlement. The mercenary army that assembled outside Carthage in late 241 BCE numbered approximately 20,000 men, representing one of the largest concentrations of professional soldiers in the ancient world. These warriors established their camp at Sicca Veneria, a city roughly 100 miles southwest of Carthage, where they awaited the promised payments and arrangements for their return home. The diversity of languages, customs, and military traditions within this force created immediate challenges for maintaining discipline and unity, but their shared grievances against Carthage provided a powerful unifying factor. The Carthaginian government's handling of the payment negotiations demonstrated a catastrophic failure of diplomatic judgment. Rather than addressing the mercenaries' legitimate financial claims promptly and fairly, Carthaginian officials attempted to reduce the promised payments through various legal technicalities and accounting manipulations. They argued that certain bonuses and allowances had been contingent on victory rather than service, and that deductions should be made for equipment and supplies provided during the campaigns. These arguments, while perhaps legally defensible, ignored the explosive potential of denying payment to heavily armed professional soldiers who had sacrificed years of their lives in Carthaginian service. The situation deteriorated rapidly when the mercenaries, frustrated by the prolonged negotiations and suspicious of Carthaginian intentions, began moving closer to Carthage itself. The sight of this massive armed force approaching the capital city created panic among the civilian population and forced the government to take increasingly desperate measures. The Carthaginian Senate authorized additional negotiations, but the fundamental problem remained. The treasury simply lacked the funds to meet the mercenaries' demands in full. The transformation of labor dispute into armed rebellion occurred when the mercenaries elected their own leaders and began coordinating resistance to Carthaginian authority. The most significant of these leaders was Spendius, a former Roman slave who had escaped during the war and enlisted in Carthaginian service. His knowledge of Roman military methods and his bitter hatred of both Rome and Carthage made him a natural leader for the disaffected mercenaries. Alongside him emerged Matho, a Libyan chieftain whose tribal connections would prove crucial in spreading the rebellion beyond the mercenary camps. The rebellion's expansion into a general uprising throughout Carthaginian North Africa occurred with shocking speed. The Berber tribes, long resentful of Carthaginian taxation and military conscription, saw the mercenary revolt as an opportunity to throw off foreign domination. The Libyan cities that had provided agricultural products and tribute to Carthage declared their independence and opened their gates to the rebel forces. Within months, the rebellion had spread from the original mercenary camp to encompass virtually all of Carthage's African territories outside the immediate vicinity of the capital city. The rebels' military capabilities were formidable, combining the professional skills of the mercenary veterans with the local knowledge and numerical strength of the African tribes. The mercenary infantry, trained in the latest military techniques and equipped with weapons captured from Carthaginian arsenals, formed disciplined battle lines capable of meeting Carthaginian forces on equal terms. The Berber cavalry, fighting on familiar terrain and motivated by generations of grievances, provided mobility and reconnaissance capabilities that often surpassed those of their opponents. The siege of Carthage itself began in earnest during 240 BCE, as rebel forces systematically captured the towns and fortresses that protected the capital's landward approaches. The rebels established fortified camps at strategic locations, cutting off the roads that connected Carthage to its agricultural hinterland and disrupting the supply lines that sustained the city's population. The Carthaginian government found itself trapped within its own capital, dependent on seaborne supplies and facing the prospect of starvation if the rebellion continued. The psychological impact of the rebellion on Carthaginian society was devastating. The city that had dominated North African trade for centuries suddenly found itself besieged by its own former soldiers and subjects. The wealthy merchant families who had profited from the empire's commercial networks watched their estates burn and their caravans captured. The urban population, accustomed to the security provided by Carthaginian military power, faced the terrifying prospect of massacre if the rebels succeeded in storming the city walls. Into this desperate situation stepped Hamilcar Barca, the general who had commanded Carthaginian forces during the final phases of the First Punic War. Hamilcar's appointment to lead the campaign against the mercenaries marked a turning point in both the immediate crisis and the longer-term development of Carthaginian policy. Unlike the cautious aristocrats who had dominated Carthaginian politics, Hamilcar brought a ruthless pragmatism and innovative military thinking that would characterize the Barcid family's approach to warfare. Hamilcar's initial challenge was assembling a loyal force capable of confronting the rebel armies. The regular Carthaginian military had been largely disbanded following the war's conclusion, and the remaining troops were insufficient to face the massive rebel coalition. Hamilcar solved this problem through a combination of recruitment strategies that demonstrated his political acumen and military innovation. He enlisted Carthaginian citizens who had previously been exempt from military service, created new units from allied cities that remained loyal, and most controversially, hired fresh mercenary companies to fight against their former comrades. The campaign that followed became known as the Truceless War, a name that reflected the unprecedented brutality and desperation that characterized the conflict. Unlike conventional wars between established states, this struggle involved no diplomatic protocols, no prisoner exchanges, and no hope of negotiated settlement. Both sides understood that defeat meant annihilation, creating a cycle of atrocities that shocked even the violence-hardened ancient world. Hamilcar's military strategy combined conventional tactics with psychological warfare designed to break the rebels' unity and resolve. He avoided direct confrontation with the main rebel armies, instead focusing on isolated detachments and supply lines. His forces would strike suddenly at rebel camps, capture their supplies, and execute prisoners in full view of their comrades. These tactics, while effective militarily, further escalated the conflict's brutality and eliminated any possibility of reconciliation. The rebels responded with equal savagery, crucifying captured Carthaginian soldiers and displaying their bodies along the roads leading to Carthage. They tortured prisoners to extract information about Carthaginian plans and executed civilians suspected of supporting the government. The breakdown of military discipline and the involvement of tribal warriors unfamiliar with Mediterranean warfare customs contributed to the conflict's exceptional violence. The turning point in the Truceless War came when Hamilcar succeeded in exploiting divisions within the rebel coalition. The mercenary veterans, despite their grievances against Carthage, remained professional soldiers who understood the importance of discipline and strategic planning. The tribal warriors, motivated by different objectives and unfamiliar with siege warfare, often acted independently and sometimes counterproductively. Hamilcar's agents worked systematically to widen these divisions, offering amnesty to certain groups while threatening others with total destruction. The final phase of the rebellion saw Hamilcar's forces gradually recapturing the key positions that controlled access to Carthage. The siege of the rebel stronghold at Tunis became the campaign's decisive engagement, with Hamilcar employing innovative siege techniques that demonstrated his mastery of military engineering. His forces constructed elaborate earthworks that isolated the rebel garrison from external support, while simultaneously protecting the besiegers from sorties and relief attempts. The capture of Spendius and Matho marked the effective end of organised resistance. Though scattered, fighting continued for several more months. Hamilcar's treatment of the captured rebel leaders reflected both his desire for revenge and his understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. The executions were conducted publicly and with elaborate ceremony, sending a clear message to any potential future rebels about the consequences of challenging Carthaginian authority. The Truceless War's conclusion left Carthage militarily victorious but fundamentally weakened. The rebellion had devastated the agricultural regions that sustained the city's economy, destroyed the infrastructure that connected Carthage to its territories, and revealed the fragility of an empire built on mercenary armies and tribute payments. The financial costs of suppressing the rebellion, combined with the ongoing payments to Rome, left the Carthaginian treasury in an even more precarious position than before. During Carthage's internal struggles, Rome seized an opportunity that would permanently alter the balance of power in the Western Mediterranean. The Roman Senate, observing Carthage's weakness and the spread of rebellion to the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, decided to violate the recently signed Treaty of Lutatius and annex these strategically important territories. This decision represented a calculated act of opportunism that would have profound consequences for future Roman-Carthaginian relations. The Roman justification for this annexation was characteristically legalistic and cynical. Roman officials claimed that Carthaginian preparations to suppress the rebellion in Sardinia constituted a threat to Roman security, since Roman merchants and citizens might be endangered by the military operations. This argument ignored the obvious fact that Carthage was merely attempting to restore order in its own territories, and that the rebellion itself posed no direct threat to Roman interests. The Roman occupation of Sardinia and Corsica proceeded with minimal resistance, as the Carthaginian government lacked the military resources to defend these distant territories while simultaneously fighting for survival in North Africa. The rebel forces that had seized control of the islands were quickly overwhelmed by Roman legions, and the Carthaginian garrisons were either captured or forced to evacuate. The ease of this conquest demonstrated both the effectiveness of Roman military organisation and the extent of Carthaginian weakness following the Truceless War. The annexation of Sardinia and Corsica provided Rome with several strategic advantages that would prove crucial in future conflicts. The islands' positions in the central Mediterranean gave Roman naval forces advanced bases for operations against Carthaginian shipping and coastal territories. The mineral resources of Sardinia, particularly its silver mines, provided additional revenue for the Roman treasury. Most importantly, the annexation demonstrated Rome's willingness to exploit Carthaginian weakness and violate treaty obligations when advantageous. The Carthaginian response to this Roman aggression was necessarily limited by their military and financial constraints. The government protested the annexation through diplomatic channels, but lacked the power to prevent it through military action. The additional indemnity of 1,200 talents that Rome demanded as compensation for the alleged threat to Roman interests further strained Carthaginian resources and deepened the sense of humiliation that pervaded Carthaginian society. The psychological impact of losing Sardinia and Corsica extended far beyond the immediate strategic and economic consequences. These territories had been part of the Carthaginian Empire for centuries, and their loss represented a fundamental challenge to Carthaginian identity and prestige. The wealthy families who had invested in Sardinian mining operations and Corsican agricultural estates saw their fortunes diminished, while the broader population witnessed their empire's continued contraction under Roman pressure. Hamilcar Barca's response to these setbacks would reshape Carthaginian strategy and set the stage for the Second Punic War. Rather than accepting the new status quo and focusing on internal reconstruction, Hamilcar advocated for an aggressive policy of expansion that would compensate for the lost territories and restore Carthaginian power. His attention turned to the Iberian Peninsula, where Carthaginian trading posts and mining operations offered the potential for creating a new territorial base that could rival the lost possessions. The Spanish territories that attracted Hamilcar's attention were far from unified or pacified. The Iberian Peninsula contained dozens of tribal groups, each with distinct languages, customs, and military traditions. The Turdetani of southern Spain had developed sophisticated urban centres and metalworking industries, while the Celtiberian tribes of the interior maintained warrior cultures that prized individual combat and tribal loyalty. The coastal regions had been influenced by centuries of Phoenician and Greek colonization, creating a complex mixture of Mediterranean and indigenous cultures. Hamilcar's Spanish campaign, beginning in 237 BCE, represented a fundamental departure from traditional Carthaginian imperial policy. Rather than establishing trading posts and negotiating tribute agreements, Hamilcar sought to create a unified territorial state under direct Carthaginian control. This approach required systematic conquest of the indigenous tribes, establishment of permanent military colonies, and integration of Spanish resources into a coherent economic system. The military forces that Hamilcar assembled for the Spanish campaigns reflected both the lessons learned during the Truceless War and the realities of operating in a distant theatre. The core of his army consisted of African troops whose loyalty had been tested during the rebellion, supplemented by Spanish auxiliaries recruited from tribes that had allied with Carthage. The diversity of this force created both opportunities and challenges, as different units brought specialised skills while requiring careful coordination to maintain effectiveness. Hamilcar's Spanish campaigns demonstrated the military innovations that would later characterise the Barcid approach to warfare. He emphasised mobility and adaptability, using cavalry forces to conduct reconnaissance and pursuit operations while employing infantry formations flexible enough to adapt to varied terrain and enemy tactics. His siege techniques, refined during the Truceless War, proved effective against the hilltop fortifications that dominated Spanish defensive systems. The establishment of New Carthage in 228 BCE marked the culmination of Hamilcar's Spanish strategy. This city, built on the site of the existing settlement of Mastia, was designed to serve as the capital of Carthaginian Spain and the base for further expansion. The city's magnificent harbour could accommodate the largest warships, while its defensive walls and citadel provided security against both external attack and internal rebellion. The surrounding region's silver mines generated enormous wealth that flowed back to both Carthage and the Barcid family's private coffers. The death of Hamilcar in 229 BCE, killed in battle against the Veterans tribe, marked the end of the first phase of Carthaginian expansion in Spain, but not the end of Barcid ambitions. Command of the Spanish territories passed to Hasdrubal, Hamilcar's son-in-law, who continued the policies of territorial expansion, while adding a diplomatic dimension that would prove crucial for future operations. Hasdrubal's marriage alliances with Spanish tribal leaders and his construction projects in New Carthage demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both military and political requirements for maintaining control over conquered territories. The Roman response to Carthaginian expansion in Spain was initially cautious, reflecting both the distance of the theatre and the complexity of Mediterranean politics. Roman merchants had established trading relationships with Spanish tribes, particularly in the regions north of the Ebro River, and Roman officials were concerned about the potential impact of Carthaginian expansion on these commercial interests. However, the Romans also recognized that direct intervention in Spain would require substantial military commitments and might provoke another major war with Carthage. The diplomatic solution that emerged was the Ebro Treaty of 226 BCE, negotiated between Hasdrubal and Roman representatives. This agreement established the Ebro River as the northern boundary of Carthaginian expansion in Spain, while recognizing Carthaginian control over the territories south of this line. The treaty also included provisions protecting the Greek city of Saguntum, which had established friendly relations with Rome and sought protection against Carthaginian expansion. The Ebro Treaty represented a temporary compromise that satisfied neither side's ultimate objectives. The Romans had succeeded in limiting Carthaginian expansion and protecting their commercial interests in northern Spain, while maintaining the option of future intervention if circumstances changed. The Carthaginians had gained recognition of their Spanish conquests and the freedom to continue expansion within the agreed boundaries while avoiding immediate confrontation with Rome. The treaty's provisions regarding Saguntum would prove particularly significant in the coming years. This prosperous Greek city, located well south of the Ebro River but granted special protection by Rome, represented a potential flashpoint for future conflict. The city's strategic position on the eastern Spanish coast and its wealth from Mediterranean trade made it an attractive target for Carthaginian expansion, while its special relationship with Rome created a tripwire that could trigger renewed warfare. The rise of the Barcid family to virtual independence in Spain created a new dynamic in Mediterranean politics that would ultimately lead to the Second Punic War. Hasdrubal's administration of Spanish territories operated with minimal oversight from Carthage, generating enormous revenues that funded both local military forces and the family's political ambitions. The Barcids had created a personal empire within the broader Carthaginian state, complete with its own armies, financial resources, and diplomatic relationships. The death of Hasdrubal in 221 BCE brought to power the most famous member of the Barcid family, Hannibal, son of Hamilcar, and inheritor of both his father's military genius and his burning hatred of Rome. Hannibal's assumption of command in Spain at the age of 26 marked the beginning of the final phase of rising tensions that would culminate in the Second Punic War. His youth belied his extensive military experience and his sophisticated understanding of both strategic and tactical warfare. The new Carthaginian commander's first actions demonstrated both his military capabilities and his political acumen. Hannibal consolidated Barcid control over the Spanish territories through a series of campaigns against unconquered tribes, while simultaneously strengthening the defences of New Carthage and expanding the recruitment of Spanish auxiliaries. His treatment of conquered peoples balanced severity with generosity, creating a system of control that would prove remarkably durable during the coming years of warfare. The stage was thus set for the final confrontation between Rome and Carthage. The truceless war had demonstrated Carthaginian vulnerability while elevating Hamilcar Barca to prominence. Roman opportunism in seizing Sardinia and Corsica had deepened Carthaginian resentment while providing Rome with strategic advantages. The Spanish expansion had created a new Carthaginian power base under Barcid control, while the Ebro Treaty had established the diplomatic framework within which the next conflict would develop. The rise of Hannibal to command of the Spanish territories brought to power a leader whose military genius and personal hatred of Rome would drive the Mediterranean world into its most destructive war yet. The attack on Saguntum in 219 BCE was not a spontaneous act of aggression, but a carefully calculated move in Hannibal's broader strategy to provoke Rome into a war that would be fought on terms favourable to Carthage. The young Carthaginian commander understood that the existing balance of power in the Mediterranean inevitably favoured Rome, whose Italian confederation provided inexhaustible manpower reserves, and whose control of the central Mediterranean islands offered strategic advantages that would only increase with time. Rather than allowing Rome to choose the moment and manner of the next conflict, Hannibal decided to force the issue while Carthage still possessed the military resources and Spanish territorial base necessary for a successful campaign. Saguntum's position as a Roman protectorate south of the Ebro River created the perfect pretext for Hannibal's provocative strategy. The city's wealth, derived from its position as a major trading hub connecting the Spanish interior with Mediterranean commercial networks, had enabled its citizens to construct impressive defensive walls and maintain a well-equipped citizen militia. The city's Greek cultural heritage and its formal alliance with Rome made it a symbol of resistance to Carthaginian expansion, while its location on the eastern Spanish coast provided strategic value for controlling maritime access to the Iberian Peninsula. The siege itself demonstrated Hannibal's mastery of both military engineering and psychological warfare. Rather than attempting a direct assault on Saguntum's formidable walls, Hannibal's forces constructed elaborate circumvallation works that completely surrounded the city and prevented any possibility of relief or resupply. These siege works, built according to the most advanced techniques of ancient military engineering, included multiple lines of trenches, wooden palisades reinforced with iron spikes, and artillery positions equipped with torsion engines capable of hurling heavy stones over considerable distances. The Carthaginian army that undertook the siege represented the full diversity of Hannibal's military resources. Spanish infantry, recruited from the Celtiberian tribes and armed with their distinctive falcata swords and small round shields, formed the backbone of the assault forces. These warriors, accustomed to the mountainous terrain of the Spanish interior, proved particularly effective in the close-quarters combat that characterized siege warfare. African infantry, veterans of the campaigns that had established Carthaginian control over southern Spain, provided the disciplined core around which the more irregular Spanish forces could operate. The siege engines employed by Hannibal's forces showcased the technological sophistication that Carthaginian military engineers had developed during decades of Spanish campaigning. Massive catapults, constructed from timber harvested in the Spanish mountains and reinforced with iron fittings forged in New Carthage's workshops, could hurl stones weighing over 100 pounds with sufficient force to shatter defensive walls. Battering rams, protected by wheeled shelters covered with wet hides to prevent fire damage, systematically weakened the city's gates and wall sections. Mobile towers, tall enough to overtop Saguntum's walls, allowed Carthaginian archers and javelin throwers to provide covering fire for assault parties. The defenders of Saguntum, led by their elected magistrates and supported by a small Roman advisory mission, employed every available defensive technique to resist the Carthaginian assault. The city's walls, constructed from local stone and reinforced with timber frameworks, were repeatedly repaired during the siege despite constant bombardment. The defenders used fire arrows and incendiary devices to destroy Carthaginian siege equipment, while sorties launched from hidden gates disrupted the construction of assault works. The civilian population, including women and children, participated in the defence by carrying supplies to the walls and assisting in the repair of battle damage. The siege's duration, extending over 8 months, reflected both the strength of Saguntum's defences and Hannibal's strategic patience. The Carthaginian commander understood that the siege's primary purpose was not merely to capture a single city, but to create a crisis that would force Rome to choose between abandoning a loyal ally or declaring war against Carthage. Each month that the siege continued increased the pressure on Roman decision-makers, while simultaneously demonstrating Carthaginian military capabilities to potential allies and enemies throughout the Mediterranean. The psychological dimension of the siege extended far beyond the immediate military considerations. Hannibal's treatment of prisoners and his negotiations with other Spanish cities during the siege demonstrated his understanding of the broader political implications of his actions. Captured Roman advisors were treated with ostentatious courtesy before being released to carry reports of Carthaginian strength back to Rome. Spanish tribal leaders were invited to observe the siege operations, allowing them to witness the fate that awaited cities that opposed Carthaginian expansion. The fall of Saguntum in late 219 BCE created exactly the crisis that Hannibal had anticipated. The city's final assault, launched simultaneously from multiple directions after months of preparation, overwhelmed the exhausted defenders and resulted in the complete destruction of this once prosperous community. The systematic looting that followed provided Hannibal's forces with enormous quantities of gold, silver and manufactured goods, while the enslavement of the surviving population sent a clear message about the consequences of opposing Carthaginian power. The Roman response to Saguntum's destruction revealed both the strengths and limitations of Roman diplomatic and military decision-making. The Roman Senate, dominated by conservative voices who preferred negotiation to warfare, initially attempted to resolve the crisis through diplomatic channels. A Roman embassy, led by Quintus Fabius Maximus, travelled to Carthage with demands for Hannibal's surrender and compensation for the destruction of Saguntum. This diplomatic mission, conducted with characteristic Roman formality and legal precision, represented the final attempt to avoid a conflict that many senators recognized would be far more devastating than the First Punic War. The Carthaginian government's response to the Roman ultimatum exposed the complex political dynamics that had developed within the Carthaginian state. The Carthaginian Senate, still dominated by the merchant families who had traditionally controlled the city's foreign policy, found themselves confronted with a fait accompli created by the Barcid family's independent actions in Spain. While many Carthaginian politicians privately questioned the wisdom of provoking Rome, the enormous wealth generated by the Spanish territories and the popularity of the Barcid family among the common people made it politically impossible to disavow Hannibal's actions. The declaration of war that followed the failure of diplomatic negotiations marked the beginning of a conflict that would reshape the ancient world. Unlike the First Punic War, which had begun almost accidentally through the Mamertine crisis, the Second Punic War represented a deliberate collision between two fundamentally incompatible visions of Mediterranean dominance. Rome's confederation system, based on the gradual integration of conquered peoples into a unified political structure, could not coexist with Carthaginian commercial empire, which depended on maintaining exclusive control over key trade routes and resource-producing regions. Hannibal's decision to march overland to Italy represented one of the most audacious strategic gambles in military history. The conventional wisdom of ancient warfare suggested that any attack on Italy should be launched from the sea, utilizing Carthaginian naval superiority to transport armies directly to the Italian coast. However, Hannibal recognized that Roman naval capabilities had improved dramatically since the First Punic War, and that a seaborne invasion would face the combined opposition of Roman and Allied fleets operating from secure bases throughout the central Mediterranean. The overland route through southern France and across the Alps offered several strategic advantages that compensated for its obvious difficulties. The march would allow Hannibal to maintain the element of surprise, as Roman strategic planning had not seriously considered the possibility of a major Carthaginian army approaching Italy from the north. The route would also enable Hannibal to recruit additional forces from the Gallic tribes of southern France, who had their own grievances against Roman expansion and could provide valuable cavalry and infantry reinforcements. The army that Hannibal assembled for the Italian expedition represented the culmination of decades of military development in Carthaginian Spain. The force that departed New Carthage in the spring of 218 BCE numbered approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, making it one of the largest armies ever assembled in the ancient world. The diversity of this force reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Carthaginian military recruitment, with contingents drawn from across the Mediterranean world and beyond. The Spanish infantry that formed the core of Hannibal's army had been forged through years of campaigning in the rugged terrain of the Iberian Peninsula. These troops, armed with the falcata and protected by small round shields, reinforced with iron bosses, excelled in the close-quarters combat that characterized ancient warfare. Their experience in mountain warfare would prove invaluable during the Alpine crossing, while their loyalty to Hannibal personally ensured the army's cohesion during the coming trials. The African infantry contingents brought different strengths to Hannibal's force. These troops, recruited from the Berber tribes of the Atlas Mountains, and the settled populations of the Carthaginian territories were equipped with longer spears and larger shields that made them effective in formal battle formations. Their experience in the truceless war had taught them the importance of discipline and unit cohesion, qualities that would prove essential during the prolonged campaigns in Italy. The cavalry forces that accompanied Hannibal represented the finest mounted warriors of the ancient world. The Numidian light cavalry, riding their small but hardy horses without saddles or bridles, possessed unmatched skills in reconnaissance, harassment, and pursuit operations. These riders, armed with javelins and small shields, could cover enormous distances and strike enemy forces before disappearing into the landscape. The Spanish heavy cavalry, better armoured and equipped with longer spears, provided the shock action necessary for decisive battlefield engagements. The war elephants that accompanied Hannibal's army were not merely exotic additions designed to intimidate enemies, but represented sophisticated military technology adapted to ancient battlefield conditions. These animals, trained from infancy to respond to their mahouts' commands, could break enemy formations through sheer physical force while providing elevated platforms for archers and javelin throwers. The psychological impact of elephants on troops who had never encountered them was enormous, often causing panic and flight before actual combat began. The march through southern France proceeded more smoothly than Hannibal had anticipated, as the Gallic tribes proved receptive to Carthaginian diplomacy and recruitment efforts. The Volcae, who controlled the region around modern Montpellier, initially opposed the Carthaginian advance, but were quickly defeated in a series of engagements that demonstrated the effectiveness of Hannibal's combined arms tactics. The victory allowed Hannibal to secure his communications with Spain while recruiting additional Gallic warriors for the Italian campaign. The crossing of the Rhone River presented the first major logistical challenge of the campaign. The river's width and current made it impossible for the army to ford, while the presence of hostile tribes on the eastern bank threatened to disrupt the crossing operations. Hannibal's solution demonstrated the engineering skills that Carthaginian military commanders had developed during their Spanish campaigns. His engineers constructed a fleet of boats and rafts capable of transporting the entire army, while a detachment sent upstream crossed at a narrower point and attacked the enemy from behind. The transportation of the war elephants across the Rhone required particular ingenuity. Hannibal's engineers constructed massive rafts covered with earth and vegetation to make them appear like solid ground. The elephants, led by their mahouts, were coaxed onto these platforms and ferried across the river despite their obvious distress at the unfamiliar situation. Several elephants were lost during the crossing when their rafts overturned, but the majority of the herd survived to continue the march toward the Alps. The approach to the Alpine passes brought Hannibal into contact with the mountain tribes who controlled these crucial routes. The Allobroges, who dominated the region around modern Grenoble, initially appeared willing to provide guides and supplies for the Carthaginian army. However, Their true intentions became clear when they launched a coordinated attack on the Carthaginian column as it entered the narrow defiles leading to the high passes. The ambush, conducted from the heights above the marching route, caused significant casualties and nearly succeeded in blocking the army's advance. Hannibal's response to this crisis demonstrated both his tactical flexibility and his understanding of mountain warfare. Rather than attempting to force his way through the ambush, he divided his forces and launched a night attack on the tribal stronghold that controlled the pass. The assault, conducted by picked troops familiar with mountain climbing, succeeded in capturing the position and scattering the defenders. The victory not only opened the route to Italy, but also provided the army with supplies and equipment that would prove essential during the coming Alpine crossing. The actual crossing of the Alps represented one of the most remarkable achievements in ancient military history. The route that Hannibal chose, probably through the Col de Clapière or a similar high pass, required the army to traverse terrain that challenged even experienced mountain travellers. The narrow paths, often carved into cliff faces, could accommodate only single-file movement and offered no protection from rock slides or enemy attacks. The altitude, exceeding 8,000 feet at the highest points, created breathing difficulties for men and animals accustomed to sea-level conditions. The weather conditions that the army encountered during the crossing were far worse than Hannibal had anticipated. Early snowfall, unusual for the season, created treacherous footing and reduced visibility to mere yards. The cold, particularly severe at night, caused frostbite and hypothermia among troops equipped for Mediterranean campaigning. The elephants native to the warm climates of North Africa suffered particularly severely from the cold and altitude, with several dying during the crossing. The logistical challenges of feeding and supplying the army during the Alpine crossing pushed Carthaginian organisational capabilities to their limits. The narrow mountain paths made it impossible to transport the army's normal baggage train, forcing soldiers to carry their own equipment and supplies. Food became increasingly scarce as the crossing continued, with the army reduced to eating pack animals and leather equipment. The lack of fodder for the cavalry horses and elephants created additional difficulties, as these animals required substantial quantities of food to maintain their strength. The psychological impact of the Alpine crossing on both the Carthaginian army and their enemies cannot be overstated. For the Carthaginian troops, the successful completion of what had seemed an impossible journey created a sense of invincibility and absolute confidence in their commander's abilities. The soldiers who emerged from the Alps had been transformed by their ordeal into a brotherhood of veterans who had overcome obstacles that would have defeated lesser men. This psychological transformation would prove crucial during the coming campaigns in Italy. The Roman response to news of Hannibal's Alpine crossing revealed the limitations of their strategic intelligence and planning. Roman commanders had dismissed the possibility of a major Carthaginian army approaching Italy from the north, focusing their preparations on defending against seaborne invasions. The consular armies that had been positioned to intercept Carthaginian naval forces found themselves completely out of position to respond to the actual threat. The psychological shock of Hannibal's achievement created panic in Rome itself, as citizens realized that their city faced a more serious threat than anyone had imagined. The army that descended from the Alps into the Po Valley numbered fewer than 26,000 men, representing losses of nearly 70% during the march from Spain. However, the survivors represented the elite of Carthaginian military capability, hardened by months of campaigning and united by their shared ordeal. The elephants had suffered even more severely, with only a handful surviving the crossing in fighting condition. Despite these losses, Hannibal had achieved his primary objective. He had brought a professional army into Italy and positioned it to threaten Rome's northern territories. The first engagement between Hannibal's forces and Roman troops occurred at the Ticinus River in November 218 BCE. The Roman army, commanded by consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, had been hastily assembled from troops originally destined for operations in Spain. The battle, primarily a cavalry engagement, demonstrated the superiority of Carthaginian mounted forces over their Roman counterparts. The Numidian light cavalry, operating with their characteristic mobility and tactical flexibility, outmaneuvered the Roman and allied cavalry, inflicting significant casualties and forcing the Romans to retreat. The victory at Ticinus provided Hannibal with several crucial advantages beyond the immediate tactical success. The defeat of Roman cavalry eliminated their ability to conduct effective reconnaissance, leaving Roman commanders blind to Carthaginian movements and intentions. The psychological impact of the victory encouraged the Gallic tribes of northern Italy to openly support the Carthaginian cause, providing Hannibal with additional recruits and local knowledge of the terrain. Most importantly, the battle demonstrated to both sides that Carthaginian forces could meet and defeat Roman armies in open combat. The Battle of Trebia, fought in December 218 BCE, represented Hannibal's first major victory over a full Roman army and established the tactical patterns that would characterize his Italian campaigns. The Roman force, commanded by consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, numbered approximately 40,000 men and represented a typical consular army of the period. The troops included 2 Roman legions, each numbering about 5,200 men, supplemented by an equal number of allied troops and a small cavalry contingent. Hannibal's tactical plan for the Battle of Trebia demonstrated his mastery of deception and his understanding of Roman military psychology. Rather than seeking a direct confrontation, he positioned his army on the far side of the Trebia River and used his light cavalry to harass the Roman camp throughout the night. These attacks, while causing minimal casualties, prevented the Romans from resting and created pressure on Sempronius to seek a decisive engagement. The Carthaginian commander understood that Roman military culture emphasized aggressive action, and that patient defensive tactics would be difficult for Roman commanders to maintain. The battle began at dawn when Hannibal's cavalry and light infantry crossed the Trebia and launched probing attacks against the Roman positions. Sempronius, eager to bring the elusive Carthaginians to battle, ordered his entire army to cross the river and advance against the enemy positions. The Romans formed their traditional battle line, with the legions in the centre and allied troops on the flanks, supported by the small cavalry force that had survived the Ticinus engagement. The crossing of the Trebia River in winter conditions created immediate difficulties for the Roman forces. The water, swollen by recent rains and snowmelt, reached chest height in many places and was so cold that soldiers emerged with numbed limbs and reduced fighting effectiveness. The Romans had been forced to march without breakfast, as the Carthaginian harassment had prevented normal meal preparation, leaving them hungry and tired before the battle even began. Hannibal's battle formation reflected his understanding of combined arms tactics and his ability to coordinate diverse military units. The centre of his line consisted of Gallic infantry, reinforced by Spanish troops and positioned to absorb the initial Roman assault. The flanks were held by African infantry, equipped with captured Roman equipment and trained to fight in the Roman manner. The cavalry, divided between the wings, included both Numidian light horse and Spanish heavy cavalry positioned to exploit any opportunities that developed during the battle. The crucial element of Hannibal's tactical plan was a hidden force of 2,000 picked troops, commanded by his brother Mago, concealed in a stream bed behind the Roman line. This force, consisting of infantry and cavalry selected for their stealth and initiative, remained undetected throughout the battle's opening phases. Their mission was to attack the Roman rear at the critical moment, creating panic and confusion that would transform tactical success into strategic victory. The battle's initial phase proceeded according to Roman expectations, with the legions advancing steadily against the Carthaginian centre and gradually pushing back the Gallic infantry. The Roman tactical system, based on the flexibility of the manipular formation, proved effective against the less organised Gallic resistance. However, The Roman cavalry on both flanks found themselves overwhelmed by superior Carthaginian mounted forces, leaving the legions increasingly isolated and vulnerable to envelopment. The turning point came when Mago's hidden force emerged from concealment and struck the Roman rear with devastating effect. The attack, launched at the moment when the Roman legions were fully engaged with the Carthaginian centre, created immediate panic among the Roman support troops and baggage handlers. The psychological impact of being attacked from behind, combined with the physical exhaustion of fighting in winter conditions, caused portions of the Roman line to collapse. The Carthaginian victory at Trebia was comprehensive and devastating. The Roman army lost approximately 30,000 men, including most of the Allied contingents and a significant portion of the Roman legions. Only about 10,000 Romans, fighting in close formation around their standards, managed to cut their way through the Carthaginian lines and reach safety. The psychological impact of the defeat reverberated throughout Italy, as news spread that a Roman consular army had been virtually annihilated by the Carthaginian invaders. The aftermath of Trebia demonstrated Hannibal's sophisticated understanding of political warfare and his strategy for undermining Roman power in Italy. Rather than pursuing the retreating Romans, he focused on consolidating his position in northern Italy and recruiting additional forces from the Gallic tribes. His treatment of captured Roman allies was particularly significant. While Roman citizens were held for ransom or executed, Allied troops were released without payment and encouraged to return to their home cities with accounts of Carthaginian generosity. The winter of 218-217 BCEE allowed Hannibal to rest and reorganize his forces while planning the next phase of his Italian campaign. The army that had emerged victorious from Trebia was significantly different from the force that had crossed the Alps. The Gallic recruits who had joined the Carthaginian cause provided local knowledge and increased the army's size to approximately 50,000 men. However, the integration of these new troops required careful attention to training and discipline, as the Gallic warriors brought different fighting styles and military traditions. The Roman response to the Trebia disaster revealed both the resilience of the Roman political system and the limitations of their military doctrine. The Senate authorized the recruitment of additional legions and the recall of forces from other theatres, demonstrating Rome's ability to mobilize resources even after major defeats. The catastrophic defeat at Trebia had shattered Roman confidence, but the disaster that unfolded at Lake Trasimene in June 217 BCE would push the Republic to the very brink of collapse. Gaius Flaminius, the newly elected consul, whose aggressive temperament had made him popular with the Roman masses, embodied the traditional Roman approach to warfare that emphasized decisive action and direct confrontation. His appointment reflected the Senate's belief that Roman military virtues, properly applied, could overcome even Hannibal's tactical innovations. This conviction would prove disastrously misguided. Hannibal's march south from his winter quarters in northern Italy demonstrated his growing mastery of Italian geography and his sophisticated understanding of Roman psychology. Rather than advancing directly toward Rome, which would have allowed the Romans to choose their defensive positions, the Carthaginian commander struck through the marshes of the Arno River Valley. This route, considered impassable by Roman strategic planners, brought Hannibal's army into central Italy while bypassing the defensive positions that Flaminius had prepared. The passage through the Arno marshes exacted a terrible toll on the Carthaginian forces. The spring floods had transformed the region into a vast swamp where men and animals struggled through knee-deep water mixed with mud and vegetation. The army marched in single file along narrow causeways, vulnerable to disease and exhaustion. Many soldiers developed severe eye infections from the contaminated water, and even Hannibal himself lost the sight in one eye during this grueling advance. The surviving war elephants, already weakened by the Alpine crossing, succumbed to the harsh conditions, leaving Hannibal without these psychological weapons for future battles. Despite these hardships, the strategic benefits of the march route proved enormous. Hannibal's sudden appearance in Etruria, the heartland of Roman Italy, created panic among the civilian population and forced Flaminius to abandon his prepared positions. The Roman consul, faced with reports of Carthaginian raids against Roman colonies and allied cities, found himself compelled to pursue an enemy who seemed to appear and disappear at will. This pursuit would lead the Roman army into the most perfectly executed ambush in ancient military history. The terrain around Lake Trasimene provided Hannibal with an ideal setting for his tactical masterpiece. The lake, stretching for miles along the valley floor, forced the Roman road into a narrow defile between the water and the surrounding hills. The hills themselves were covered with dense vegetation that could conceal large bodies of troops, while the morning mists that rose from the lake would provide additional cover for the Carthaginian deployment. Hannibal positioned his forces with meticulous care, placing his African infantry on the heights overlooking the road, while Spanish and Gallic troops occupied positions that would allow them to close the trap once the Romans had entered the killing ground. The Roman army that marched into this trap on the morning of June 21st, 217 BCE, numbered approximately 25,000 men and represented one of the finest military forces that Rome had ever assembled. The two legions at the army's core consisted of experienced soldiers who had volunteered for extended service, while the allied contingents included troops from the most reliable Italian communities. The army's equipment reflected the standardization that had made Roman forces so effective. Each legionnaire carried the gladius, pilum, and scutum that had proven decisive in countless previous battles. Flaminius himself rode at the head of his army, eager to bring the elusive Carthaginians to battle and restore Roman prestige through decisive victory. The consul's impatience, while understandable given the political pressures he faced, blinded him to the tactical dangers of advancing through unfamiliar terrain without adequate reconnaissance. The Roman cavalry, already weakened by previous encounters with Carthaginian mounted forces, proved insufficient to screen the army's advance or detect the enemy positions in the hills above. The attack began at dawn as the Roman column stretched along the lakeshore road, with the mist still rising from the water and limiting visibility to a few dozen yards. Hannibal's signal initiated a coordinated assault from multiple directions that caught the Romans completely unprepared. The African infantry, charging down from the heights with their distinctive war cries, struck the Roman column's flank while it was still in marching formation. Simultaneously, the Spanish and Gallic forces emerged from concealment to block the road ahead and behind, trapping the entire Roman army in a narrow corridor between the lake and the attacking enemy. The battle that followed was less a military engagement than a systematic slaughter. The Romans, caught in column formation and unable to deploy into their standard battle line, found themselves fighting as isolated groups rather than as a coordinated army. The manipular system, so effective in open terrain, proved useless in the confined space between the lake and the hills. Individual Roman soldiers, despite their superior training and equipment, could not overcome the tactical disadvantage of fighting from an inferior position against enemies who held the initiative. The psychological impact of the ambush proved as devastating as the physical assault. Roman soldiers, accustomed to fighting in formation with their comrades, found themselves isolated and surrounded by enemies who seemed to emerge from the mist itself. The distinctive sound of Carthaginian war horns echoing off the lake and hills created an atmosphere of supernatural terror that broke the morale of even veteran troops. Many Romans, rather than face capture or death in battle, threw themselves into the lake and drowned in their heavy armour. Flaminius himself died early in the battle, struck down by a Gallic warrior who recognised the consul's distinctive armour and plume. The death of their commander completed the demoralisation of the Roman forces, as centurions and tribunes struggled to maintain order without clear leadership. The Roman standards, the sacred symbols that normally provided rallying points for scattered units, became targets for Carthaginian assault rather than sources of inspiration. the slaughter continued for nearly 3 hours, with the Carthaginians methodically destroying the trapped Roman forces. The lake itself became choked with bodies and equipment, while the narrow road was littered with the debris of a shattered army. When the mist finally lifted, the full extent of the disaster became apparent. Of the 25,000 Romans who had entered the defile, fewer than 10,000 survived, and most of these were wounded or captured. The Carthaginian losses, by contrast, were minimal, with fewer than 2,000 casualties among forces that had fought from superior positions against a helpless enemy. The news of Trasimeni's catastrophe reached Rome within days, carried by the few survivors who had managed to escape the slaughter. The urban praetor, Marcus Pomponius, addressed the assembled citizens with characteristic Roman directness: "We have been defeated in a great battle." The simple announcement triggered panic throughout the city as citizens realized that no significant Roman forces remained between Hannibal and the capital itself. The roads leading away from Rome filled with refugees fleeing to the countryside, while the remaining population prepared for siege. The Senate's response to this unprecedented crisis demonstrated both the resilience of Roman institutions and the emergence of new strategic thinking that would ultimately save the Republic. Rather than appointing new consuls who might repeat the mistakes of their predecessors, the Senate invoked the ancient office of dictator and selected Quintus Fabius Maximus for this supreme command. Fabius, a member of one of Rome's most distinguished families, brought to his new position a fundamentally different approach to warfare that would earn him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. Fabius understood that Rome's traditional military doctrine, based on seeking decisive battles and rapid campaigns, played directly into Hannibal's strengths. The Carthaginian commander excelled at tactical innovation and had proven his ability to defeat Roman armies in direct confrontation. Rather than providing Hannibal with additional opportunities to demonstrate his tactical superiority, Fabius developed a strategy of attrition designed to gradually wear down the Carthaginian forces while avoiding the pitched battles that had led to previous disasters. The Fabian strategy, as it came to be known, involved shadowing Hannibal's movements with Roman forces positioned on high ground and in fortified positions where Carthaginian cavalry could not operate effectively. Roman troops would harass Carthaginian foraging parties, attack isolated detachments, and intercept supply convoys, but would avoid any engagement that might develop into a major battle. This approach required extraordinary discipline from Roman commanders and soldiers, as it meant accepting the psychological burden of appearing to flee from an enemy who ravaged Italian territory with apparent impunity. The implementation of this strategy proved extremely difficult, both militarily and politically. Roman military culture emphasized courage, aggression, and the pursuit of glory through victory in battle. The sight of Roman armies retreating before Carthaginian forces, even as part of a deliberate strategy, created intense pressure on commanders to seek the decisive engagement that might restore Roman prestige. The Roman people, watching their countryside burn while their armies remained inactive, began to question whether their leaders possessed the courage necessary for victory. Hannibal's response to the Fabian strategy revealed both his tactical brilliance and the strategic limitations of his position in Italy. Unable to bring Roman forces to battle, he focused on demonstrating that Rome's inability to protect its allies and territories. His army moved systematically through central and southern Italy, capturing cities, devastating agricultural regions, and collecting enormous quantities of booty. These operations served multiple purposes. They provided supplies for the Carthaginian army, demonstrated Roman weakness to potential allies, and maintained the morale of troops who had expected rapid victory. The psychological warfare that accompanied these campaigns proved as important as the military operations themselves. Hannibal's treatment of captured Roman allies followed a consistent pattern designed to undermine the confederation system that provided Rome with its military strength. Roman citizens were held for ransom or executed. while allied troops were released without payment and encouraged to return to their communities with accounts of Carthaginian generosity. This policy aimed to convince Italian cities that their interests lay with Carthage rather than Rome. The first major defection from the Roman Confederation came in 216 BCE, when the city of Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to Hannibal's forces. Capua's decision reflected both the immediate military pressures created by Hannibal's presence and the longer-term tensions that existed within the Roman Confederation system. The Capuan aristocracy, despite their formal alliance with Rome, had maintained their own cultural identity and political ambitions. The prospect of Carthaginian victory offered them the possibility of regaining the independence they had lost during the Roman conquest of southern Italy. The defection of Capua created a cascade effect throughout southern Italy, as other cities reconsidered their loyalty to Rome in light of changing military circumstances. The Greek cities of southern Italy, many of which had been conquered by Rome within living memory, proved particularly susceptible to Carthaginian diplomacy. These communities retained strong cultural ties to the Greek world, and viewed Roman rule as a form of barbarian domination that might be overthrown with Carthaginian assistance. The most significant of these defections occurred when Syracuse, the greatest city of Sicily, abandoned its alliance with Rome and declared for Carthage. This decision, made by the young King Hieronymus following his grandfather Hero's death, transformed the strategic situation in Sicily and forced Rome to commit substantial military resources to maintaining control of the island. The Syracusan defection was particularly damaging because it provided Carthage with a secure base for naval operations and threatened to reverse the Roman gains of the First Punic War. The Roman response to these defections demonstrated the ruthless determination that would ultimately ensure their victory. Rather than attempting to win back the loyalty of rebellious cities through negotiation or concessions, Rome adopted a policy of exemplary punishment designed to deter further defections. Cities that had betrayed their alliance with Rome would be treated as enemies, with their populations enslaved and their territories confiscated. This harsh policy reflected the Roman understanding that the Confederation system could only survive if the costs of rebellion clearly outweighed any potential benefits. The siege of Syracuse that began in 213 BCE became one of the most famous military operations of the ancient world, largely due to the participation of the mathematician and inventor Archimedes in the city's defence. The Roman forces, commanded by Marcus Claudius Marcellus, found themselves confronting not only traditional defensive works, but also ingenious mechanical devices that demonstrated the practical applications of Greek scientific knowledge. Archimedes' war machines, including catapults of unprecedented range and accuracy, giant mirrors that focus sunlight to burn Roman ships, and mechanical cranes that could lift attacking vessels out of the water, turned the siege into a contest between Roman persistence and Greek innovation. The siege operations revealed the evolution of Roman military engineering and their ability to adapt to new challenges. The Roman army constructed elaborate siege works that surrounded Syracuse both by land and sea, cutting off the city's communications and supply lines. These works, built according to techniques developed during previous sieges, included multiple lines of trenches, wooden palisades, and artillery positions equipped with torsion engines. The scale of these operations required thousands of workers and consumed enormous quantities of materials, demonstrating Rome's ability to sustain complex military operations even while fighting on multiple fronts. The psychological dimension of the Syracuse siege proved as important as the military operations themselves. Archimedes' defensive innovations, while effective in tactical terms, could not overcome the fundamental strategic reality that Syracuse was isolated and surrounded by superior Roman forces. The city's population, initially enthusiastic about their rebellion against Rome, gradually became demoralized as the siege continued and their situation became increasingly desperate. The death of Archimedes during the final assault, killed by a Roman soldier who failed to recognize the great scientist, symbolize the tragedy of Greek intellectual achievement destroyed by Roman military pragmatism. The fall of Syracuse in 212 BCE marked a turning point in the war's Mediterranean theatre and demonstrated Rome's determination to maintain control over its empire, despite the challenges posed by Hannibal's Italian campaign. The systematic looting that followed the city's capture provided enormous wealth for the Roman treasury, while the enslavement of the population sent a clear message about the consequences of rebellion. The Roman treatment of Syracuse became a model for dealing with other rebellious cities and helped stabilize the strategic situation in Sicily. Meanwhile, in Italy, Hannibal faced increasing difficulties in maintaining his army's strength and effectiveness. The Fabian strategy of attrition, while frustrating to Roman commanders and citizens, was gradually achieving its intended effect. The Carthaginian army, operating far from its supply bases and unable to capture major Roman strongholds, found itself dependent on foraging and raiding for sustenance. The constant harassment by Roman forces, while avoiding major battles, created a steady drain on Carthaginian manpower and resources. The recruitment of Italian allies, while providing Hannibal with additional troops, also created new challenges for maintaining army cohesion and discipline. The Gallic warriors who had joined the Carthaginian cause brought different military traditions and expectations that sometimes conflicted with Carthaginian tactical requirements. The integration of these diverse forces required constant attention from Hannibal and his subordinate commanders, diverting energy from strategic planning and operations. The logistical challenges facing Hannibal's army became increasingly severe as the war continued. The Carthaginian force, numbering at its peak nearly 70,000 men, required enormous quantities of food, equipment and weapons that could not be obtained locally. The Roman strategy of removing or destroying supplies in areas threatened by Carthaginian advance forced Hannibal to disperse his forces over wide areas, reducing their tactical effectiveness and increasing their vulnerability to Roman attack. The absence of significant reinforcements from Carthage or Spain created additional pressures on Hannibal's strategic position. The Carthaginian government, distracted by Roman operations in other theatres and facing its own financial constraints, proved unable to provide the support that might have enabled decisive victory in Italy. The Spanish territories, under attack by Roman forces commanded by the Scipio brothers, required their own military resources and could not spare troops for the Italian campaign. The gradual erosion of Carthaginian strength in Italy became apparent through the changing character of military operations. The bold offensive campaigns that had characterized the war's early phases gave way to more cautious movements focused on maintaining defensive positions and protecting allied cities. Hannibal's army, while still formidable in battle, lacked the strength to undertake the systematic siege operations that would be necessary to capture major Roman strongholds like Rome itself. The strategic stalemate that developed by 211 BCE reflected the fundamental limitations of both sides' strategic approaches. Hannibal had demonstrated his ability to defeat Roman armies in battle and had succeeded in undermining parts of the Roman Confederation, but he lacked the resources necessary to achieve decisive victory. The Roman strategy of attrition was gradually weakening the Carthaginian position, but the costs of maintaining multiple armies in the field while defending against raids and rebellions strained even Rome's substantial resources. The war's character during this period was defined by the absence of major battles and the prevalence of siege warfare, raids, and diplomatic maneuvering. Both sides recognized that the conflict's outcome would be determined not by a single decisive engagement, but by their ability to sustain military operations over an extended period. This realization marked a fundamental shift in ancient warfare, as the traditional emphasis on heroic individual combat and rapid campaigns gave way to systematic approaches focused on logistics, engineering, and political warfare. The strategic stalemate that had characterized the middle years of the Second Punic War began to shift decisively in Rome's favour during 211 BCE, as the Republic's superior resources and systematic approach to warfare finally began to overcome the tactical brilliance that had sustained Hannibal's Italian campaign. The year marked a crucial turning point, not through any single dramatic victory, but through the cumulative effect of Roman persistence, strategic adaptation, and the inexorable pressure of coordinated operations across multiple theatres. The recapture of Capua in 211 BCE represented far more than the mere recovery of a rebellious city. It demonstrated Rome's evolved approach to siege warfare and their unwavering commitment to punishing defection from the Confederation. The Roman forces that surrounded Capua, commanded by the consuls Quintus Fulvius Flaccus and Appius Claudius Pulcher, had constructed one of the most sophisticated siege systems in ancient military history. The double line of circumvallation that enclosed the city consisted of an inner wall facing Capua itself and an outer wall designed to repel any Carthaginian relief force. These fortifications, built from timber and earth reinforced with stone where available, stretched for miles around the city's perimeter and required constant maintenance by thousands of Roman soldiers and allied auxiliaries. The engineering challenges of maintaining this massive siege system during the Italian winter tested Roman logistical capabilities to their limits. The soldiers manning the siege lines required daily supplies of food, water and firewood, all of which had to be transported across hostile territory, where Carthaginian raiders operated with impunity. The Roman solution involved establishing fortified supply depots at regular intervals along the roads leading to Capua, each garrisoned by sufficient troops to repel Carthaginian attacks. This network of strongpoints, connected by well-maintained roads and protected by regular patrols, demonstrated the systematic approach to warfare that would ultimately give Rome victory over more tactically gifted opponents. The Capuan defenders, led by the aristocrat Vibius Virius and supported by a Carthaginian garrison commanded by Bostar, employed every available defensive technique to resist the Roman assault. The city's walls, originally constructed during the period of Capuan independence and subsequently reinforced during the early phases of the siege, incorporated the latest developments in defensive architecture. Massive stone blocks, fitted together without mortar in the Greek manner, formed the foundation of walls that rose over 30 feet above the surrounding terrain. The parapet, protected by crenellations and equipped with artillery positions, provided defenders with excellent fields of fire against approaching attackers. The siege engines employed by both sides represented the culmination of Hellenistic military technology adapted to Roman tactical requirements. The Roman artillery, consisting primarily of ballistae and catapults, constructed by military engineers trained in Greek techniques, could hurl stone projectiles weighing up to 60 pounds with sufficient force to shatter defensive walls. The accuracy of these weapons, improved through months of practice against Capuan fortifications, allowed Roman gunners to target specific sections of the walls and gradually create breaches large enough for infantry assault. The defenders responded with their own artillery, including torsion engines capable of hurling iron-tipped bolts that could penetrate Roman shields and armour at considerable distances. Hannibal's attempt to relieve Capua in the spring of 211 BCE demonstrated both his continued tactical brilliance and the strategic limitations that increasingly constrained his operations. The Carthaginian army that marched north from its winter quarters in Bruttium numbered approximately 33,000 men, including veterans of the Alpine crossing who had survived 4 years of continuous campaigning in Italy. These troops, hardened by constant warfare and bound together by shared hardships, represented one of the finest military forces in the ancient world. Their equipment, a mixture of captured Roman arms and weapons manufactured in Carthaginian workshops established in southern Italy, reflected the army's adaptation to local conditions and resource constraints. The Roman response to Hannibal's approach revealed the confidence and tactical sophistication that their commanders had developed through years of confronting Carthaginian, military innovations. Rather than abandoning the siege to concentrate their forces against Hannibal, the Roman commanders divided their armies, maintaining sufficient troops around Capua to prevent any breakout while positioning the remainder to intercept the Carthaginian relief force. This decision, which would have been considered impossibly risky during the war's early phases, reflected the Roman understanding that their superior numbers and logistical support allowed them to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. The series of engagements that followed Hannibal's arrival demonstrated the evolution of Roman tactical doctrine and their growing ability to counter Carthaginian military innovations. The Romans avoided the pitched battles that had led to previous disasters, instead employing the harassment tactics that Fabius had pioneered, while adding aggressive elements designed to exploit Carthaginian weaknesses. Roman cavalry, reinforced by Numidian deserters who brought intimate knowledge of Carthaginian tactics, conducted hit-and-run attacks against Carthaginian supply lines and isolated detachments. These operations, while individually minor, created a cumulative effect that gradually weakened Carthaginian capabilities and morale. The psychological warfare that accompanied these military operations proved as important as the combat itself. Hannibal's famous march on Rome, conducted in a desperate attempt to force the Romans to abandon their siege of Capua, represented a calculated gamble that ultimately backfired. The Carthaginian army's appearance before the walls of Rome created temporary panic among the civilian population, but the Roman government's calm response demonstrated their confidence in the city's defences and their strategic position. The Senate's decision to continue the auction of land in the area where Hannibal had camped, allegedly selling at full price, became a powerful symbol of Roman determination that resonated throughout the Mediterranean world. The failure of Hannibal's diversionary tactics left Capua isolated and facing inevitable capture. The city's population, initially confident in their Carthaginian alliance, gradually became demoralized as food supplies dwindled and the siege walls closed ever tighter around their defenses. The Roman blockade, enforced by both land and river forces, prevented any significant supplies from reaching the city, while the constant bombardment by Roman artillery created an atmosphere of terror that broke the morale of even the most determined defenders. The final assault on Capua, launched in the autumn of 211 BCE, demonstrated the Roman mastery of siege warfare that had been developed through years of experience in Italy and Sicily. The attack began with a massive artillery bombardment designed to suppress defensive fire and create breaches in the city walls. Roman engineers, working under the protection of mobile shelters called vinna, systematically undermined sections of the wall while sappers filled in the defensive ditches that protected the city's approaches. The coordination of these operations required precise timing and communication between different units, reflecting the professional competence that Roman military organisation had achieved. The Roman treatment of Capua following its capture established precedents for dealing with rebellious allies that would influence imperial policy for centuries. The city's senators, who had led the rebellion against Rome, were executed without trial, while the remaining population was sold into slavery or relocated to distant territories. The city's territory was confiscated and distributed among Roman colonists, effectively erasing Capua's identity as an independent political entity. This harsh punishment, while shocking to contemporary observers, served notice that Rome would tolerate no challenge to its authority from within the Confederation. The psychological impact of Capua's fall reverberated throughout Italy and the broader Mediterranean world. Cities that had considered defecting to Carthage reconsidered their positions, while those that had remained loyal to Rome felt vindicated in their choice. The demonstration of Roman determination and capability sent a clear message that the Republic possessed both the military strength and political will necessary to maintain its empire despite the challenges posed by Hannibal's continued presence in Italy. While the siege of Capua was reaching its climax, events in Spain were unfolding that would prove equally decisive for the war's ultimate outcome. The Roman campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula, initially commanded by Publius Cornelius Scipio and his brother Gnaeus, had achieved remarkable success in disrupting Carthaginian control over this crucial territory. The Spanish tribes, many of whom had been forced into Carthaginian service, proved receptive to Roman diplomacy and military support, creating opportunities for the Romans to establish their own power base in the peninsula. The disaster that befell the Scipio brothers in 211 BCE, when both were killed in separate battles against Carthaginian forces, temporarily threatened to reverse these Roman gains. The death of Publius Scipio, ambushed by Carthaginian cavalry while attempting to intercept enemy reinforcements, deprived the Roman forces of their most experienced commander and created a crisis of leadership that threatened to collapse the entire Spanish campaign. The subsequent death of Gnaeus Scipio, overwhelmed by superior Carthaginian forces while attempting to maintain Roman positions, left the surviving Roman troops isolated and facing potential annihilation. The Roman response to this crisis demonstrated the resilience of their political system and their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The Senate's decision to appoint the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the deceased commander, to assume control of the Spanish operations reflected both desperation and inspired leadership selection. The younger Scipio, despite his youth and relative inexperience, possessed the charisma and tactical innovation that would transform the Spanish campaign and ultimately determine the war's outcome. Scipio's arrival in Spain in 210 BCE marked the beginning of a new phase in Roman military operations that combined traditional Roman organizational strengths with innovative tactical approaches adapted to local conditions. The Roman force that he inherited, numbering approximately 28,000 men, consisted of survivors from his father's campaigns, supplemented by fresh reinforcements from Italy. These troops, demoralized by recent defeats and uncertain about their new commander's capabilities, required immediate action to restore their confidence and effectiveness. The capture of the new Carthage in 209 BCE represented Scipio's masterpiece of strategic planning and tactical execution. The city, serving as the capital of Carthaginian Spain and the repository of enormous wealth accumulated through decades of mining operations, appeared virtually impregnable behind its massive walls and natural defences. The harbour, protected by a chain stretched across its entrance, provided secure anchorage for Carthaginian warships, while the citadel, built on a commanding height, offered a final refuge for defenders even if the city walls were breached. Scipio's intelligence network, developed through careful cultivation of Spanish allies and Carthaginian deserters, provided detailed information about New Carthage's defences and garrison strength. The Roman commander learned that the city's northern approach was protected by a lagoon that appeared impassable, but actually became fordable at low tide. This information, combined with knowledge of the garrison's routine and the city's internal layout, allowed Scipio to develop a coordinated assault plan that would exploit multiple weaknesses simultaneously. The Roman army that approached New Carthage in the spring of 209 BCE moved with the precision and confidence that characterized Scipio's military operations. The force, organized into multiple columns that could operate independently while maintaining mutual support, demonstrated the tactical flexibility that would become the hallmark of Roman military evolution. The soldiers, equipped with standardized weapons and armor but trained in adaptable formations, represented the synthesis of traditional Roman military virtues with innovative tactical approaches. The assault on New Carthage began with a feint attack against the city's main gate, designed to draw defenders away from the true point of attack. Roman troops carrying scaling ladders and protected by a barrage of covering fire from archers and slingers advanced against the walls while engineers worked to undermine the gate's foundations. The noise and confusion of this assault masked the movement of the main Roman force, which was approaching the supposedly impassable northern defences under cover of darkness. The discovery of the fordable passage through the lagoon, timed to coincide with the low tide that Scipio's intelligence had predicted, allowed a select force of Roman troops to approach the city's walls from an unexpected direction. These soldiers, chosen for their swimming ability and equipped with light armour that would not impede their movement through water, waded across the lagoon while their comrades maintained the diversionary attack. The psychological impact of Roman troops appearing on walls that the defenders had considered secure created immediate panic and confusion within the city. The coordinated nature of the final assault demonstrated the sophisticated command and control systems that Scipio had developed for his forces. Signal fires, positioned on heights surrounding the city, allowed the Roman commander to coordinate the timing of attacks from multiple directions. The use of trumpets and standards to communicate tactical instructions enabled Roman units to adapt their movements to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining overall coordination. This level of tactical sophistication, unprecedented in Roman military operations, reflected Scipio's genius for combining traditional Roman strengths with innovative approaches. The capture of New Carthage provided the Romans with enormous strategic advantages that would prove decisive in the Spanish campaign. The city's treasury, accumulated through years of mining operations and tribute collection, contained sufficient wealth to finance Roman operations throughout the peninsula. The workshops and arsenals within the city provided access to the latest military technology, including artillery engines and siege equipment that could be used in future operations. Most importantly, the capture of the city's hostages, including the families of Spanish tribal leaders, provided Scipio with powerful diplomatic leverage for negotiating alliances with indigenous peoples. The Roman treatment of New Carthage's population reflected Scipio's sophisticated understanding of political warfare and his strategy for winning Spanish support. Rather than following the harsh precedents established at Capua, Scipio released the Spanish hostages without ransom and returned them to their families with gifts and expressions of Roman friendship. This gesture, while costly in immediate terms, created enormous goodwill among the Spanish tribes and demonstrated that Roman rule might offer advantages over Carthaginian domination. The Battle of Baecula in 208 BCE marked Scipio's first major field engagement against Carthaginian forces and demonstrated his tactical innovations in open combat. The Carthaginian army, commanded by Hasdrubal Barca, occupied a strong defensive position on a plateau overlooking the Roman approach. The position, protected by steep slopes and defensive works, appeared virtually impregnable to direct assault and would have forced the Romans to attack uphill against prepared defences. Scipio's tactical solution involved a complex manoeuvre that divided his forces into multiple columns, approaching the Carthaginian position from different directions. The main Roman force advanced directly against the Carthaginian centre, drawing enemy attention and reserves to that sector. Meanwhile, Roman detachments moved around the flanks of the Carthaginian position, using the broken terrain to mask their movements until they could strike the enemy from unexpected directions. This coordinated assault, requiring precise timing and communication between widely separated units, demonstrated the tactical sophistication that would characterize Scipio's later campaigns. The Roman victory at Baecula, while not decisive in itself, forced Hasdrubal to abandon his Spanish territories and march toward Italy with the remnants of his army. This strategic withdrawal, while preserving Carthaginian forces for future operations, effectively conceded Roman control over much of southern Spain and eliminated the primary threat to Roman operations in the peninsula. The psychological impact of the victory, combined with Scipio's diplomatic initiatives among the Spanish tribes, accelerated the collapse of Carthaginian authority throughout the region. The culminating victory at Ilipa in 206 BCE demonstrated Scipio's complete mastery of the tactical innovations that would define Roman military operations for generations. The Carthaginian army, commanded by Hasdrubal Gisco and reinforced by Spanish allies, numbered approximately 70,000 men and represented the last significant Carthaginian force in the peninsula. The battle's outcome would determine whether Carthage could maintain any presence in Spain, or whether the Romans would achieve complete control over this crucial territory. The Roman force that confronted the Carthaginians at Ilipa numbered approximately 48,000 men, including both Roman legions and Spanish auxiliaries who had joined the Roman cause. The diversity of this force, while creating challenges for command and control, also provided tactical opportunities that Scipio exploited with characteristic brilliance. The Roman legions, positioned in the centre of the battle line, would engage the Carthaginian African infantry in direct combat, while the Spanish auxiliaries on the flanks would face their former comrades who had remained loyal to Carthage. Scipio's tactical plan for Ilipa involved a sophisticated double envelopment that required perfect coordination between different units operating according to separate timetables. The Roman centre, advancing at a measured pace, would engage the Carthaginian centre and hold it in place while the flanks executed a more complex manoeuvre. The Roman and Spanish forces on the wings would advance at an oblique angle, gradually extending their line while maintaining contact with the centre. This movement, timed to coincide with the engagement of the centres, would bring the Roman flanks into contact with the Carthaginian wings before the enemy could respond effectively. The execution of this plan demonstrated the training and discipline that Roman forces had achieved under Scipio's command. The legions in the centre maintained their formation and timing despite the pressure of combat, while the flanking forces executed their complex manoeuvres with precision that reflected months of practice and preparation. The coordination between different units, achieved through a combination of visual signals and predetermined tactical procedures, enabled the Romans to maintain tactical coherence while adapting to changing battlefield conditions. The collapse of the Carthaginian army at Ilipa was sudden and complete, as the double envelopment created panic among troops who found themselves attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The Carthaginian centre, engaged frontally by the Roman legions, could not respond to the threat developing on their flanks until it was too late to organise effective resistance. The Spanish allies, seeing their Carthaginian commanders in flight, abandoned their positions and either fled the battlefield or joined the Roman forces. The strategic consequences of Ilipa extended far beyond the immediate military victory. The destruction of the last significant Carthaginian army in Spain eliminated any possibility of maintaining Carthaginian control over the peninsula's resources and population. The Spanish tribes, witnessing the complete Roman victory, abandoned their remaining loyalties to Carthage and sought accommodation with the new dominant power. The wealth and manpower that had sustained Carthaginian operations for decades were now available to Rome, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the broader Mediterranean conflict. While Scipio was achieving these decisive victories in Spain, events in Italy were moving toward their own climax, as Hasdrubal Barca's army approached the Alps in its desperate attempt to reinforce his brother Hannibal. The Carthaginian force that had survived the retreat from Spain numbered approximately 50,000 men, including veterans of the Spanish campaigns and Gallic recruits gathered during the march through southern France. This army, while smaller than Hannibal's original force, represented Carthage's last hope for achieving decisive victory in Italy through the coordination of two experienced commanders operating with combined forces. The Roman response to intelligence reports of Hasdrubal's approach demonstrated the strategic coordination that had evolved during years of multi-theatre warfare. The consul Gaius Claudius Nero, commanding Roman forces shadowing Hannibal in southern Italy, received orders to detach a portion of his army for operations against the approaching Carthaginian reinforcements. This decision, requiring precise timing and coordination between widely separated Roman forces, reflected the confidence and capability that Roman commanders had developed through years of experience. The march of Nero's detachment from southern Italy to the Metaurus River in central Italy represented one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in ancient military history. The Roman force, numbering approximately 7,000 men, covered over 250 miles in less than a week while maintaining complete secrecy about their movements. The soldiers, carrying minimal equipment and supplied by prepositioned depots, demonstrated the endurance and discipline that had made Roman armies feared throughout the Mediterranean world. The Battle of the Metaurus, fought in June 207 BCE, marked the decisive turning point of the Second Punic War and eliminated Carthage's last realistic hope for victory. The combined Roman forces, commanded by Nero and his colleague Marcus Livius Salinator, numbered approximately 40,000 men and represented some of the finest troops that Rome had ever assembled. The Carthaginian army, exhausted by its long march and surprised by the presence of Roman forces from multiple theatres, found itself outnumbered and outmaneuvered by enemies who had achieved complete tactical surprise. The death of Hasdrubal Barsha during the battle's final phase eliminated not only a skilled military commander, but also the strategic coordination that might have enabled Carthaginian victory in Italy. The Carthaginian commander, recognizing that his army faced annihilation, led a final cavalry charge against the Roman lines, rather than accept capture. His death, while heroic in personal terms, left the surviving Carthaginian forces without effective leadership and ensured their complete defeat. The aftermath of the Metaurus victory demonstrated the psychological impact that decisive battles could have on the broader strategic situation. The news of Hasdrubal's death, conveyed to Hannibal through the grisly expedient of his brother's severed head thrown into the Carthaginian camp, effectively ended any hope of Carthaginian victory in Italy. Hannibal's army, isolated in the southern Italian region of Bruttium and facing increasingly confident Roman forces, could no longer threaten Roman control over the peninsula. The systematic reconquest of southern Italy that followed the Metaurus victory proceeded with methodical efficiency that reflected Roman confidence in their ultimate victory. The cities that had defected to Carthage during the war's early phases found themselves facing Roman armies that possessed both the military strength and political will necessary to reclaim rebellious territories. The siege operations that characterized this phase of the war demonstrated the Roman mastery of military engineering and their ability to sustain complex operations over extended periods. The isolation of Hannibal's forces in Bruttium, while not eliminating the Carthaginian threat entirely, reduced it to manageable proportions that allowed Rome to focus resources on other theatres. The Carthaginian army, cut off from reinforcement and gradually losing its Italian allies, could no longer conduct the offensive operations that had characterized the war's early phases. The strategic initiative had passed definitively to Rome, setting the stage for the final phase of the conflict that would determine the fate of both empires. The strategic momentum that had carried Rome through the dark years of Hannibal's Italian campaign now reached its culmination in one of the most audacious military enterprises in ancient history. Publius Cornelius Scipio's proposal to invade North Africa directly challenged the fundamental assumptions that had governed Roman strategic thinking throughout the Second Punic War. For over a decade, Roman policy had focused on containing Carthaginian forces within existing theatres, while gradually eroding their strength through attrition and defensive operations. Scipio's vision represented a revolutionary departure from this cautious approach, proposing to carry the war directly to Carthaginian territory and force a decisive resolution through offensive action. The political opposition that Scipio faced in the Roman Senate reflected deep-seated concerns about the risks inherent in his proposed strategy. Quintus Fabius Maximus, the architect of the defensive strategy that had saved Rome during its darkest hours, led the conservative faction that questioned the wisdom of abandoning proven methods for untested innovations. Fabius argued that Hannibal's continued presence in Italy made it premature to undertake overseas expeditions, and that Roman resources would be better employed in completing the reconquest of southern Italy before attempting operations in distant theatres. His concerns were not merely tactical, but reflected a fundamental philosophical difference about the nature of warfare and the appropriate level of risk that Rome should accept in pursuit of victory. The financial implications of the proposed African expedition created additional obstacles that Scipio had to overcome through careful political manoeuvring. The Roman treasury, strained by 16 years of continuous warfare across multiple theatres, lacked the resources necessary to equip and transport a major expeditionary force to North Africa. The cost of constructing the necessary transport vessels, provisioning the army for extended operations, and maintaining supply lines across the Mediterranean would require unprecedented financial commitments that many senators viewed as potentially ruinous. The memory of previous disasters, including the loss of Regulus's army during the First Punic War, reinforced concerns about the dangers of conducting military operations in Africa without adequate preparation and support. Scipio's response to these challenges demonstrated the political acumen that complemented his military genius. Rather than confronting the Senate's opposition directly, he secured appointment as consul for 205 BCE and requested assignment to Sicily, ostensibly to complete the pacification of the island following the fall of Syracuse. This appointment, while falling short of his ultimate objectives, provided him with the legal authority and territorial base necessary to prepare for African operations. The strategic position of Sicily, located less than 100 miles from the North African coast, offered ideal staging areas for the proposed invasion, while maintaining the fiction that Scipio was merely executing conventional defensive operations. The army that Scipio assembled in Sicily represented a remarkable synthesis of Roman military tradition and innovative tactical approaches developed through years of Spanish campaigning. The core of his force consisted of 2 legions composed of volunteers who had specifically requested service under Scipio's command, reflecting the personal loyalty and confidence that the young general had inspired among Roman soldiers. These troops, many of whom were veterans of the Spanish campaigns, brought with them practical experience in the flexible tactical formations that Scipio had pioneered. Their equipment, while following standard Roman patterns, incorporated modifications learned through combat against Carthaginian forces, including improved armour designs and weapons adapted to Mediterranean conditions. The recruitment of these volunteer legions revealed the transformation that had occurred within Roman military culture during the long years of the Punic Wars. The traditional citizen-soldier model, based on annual campaigns conducted by farmers who returned to their fields each winter, had evolved into a more professional system that recognised the value of experienced troops serving under proven commanders. The soldiers who joined Scipio's expedition understood that they were embarking on a campaign that might last for years and would require them to fight in unfamiliar territory against enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of local conditions. The logistical preparations for the African expedition required innovations in Roman military organisation that would influence imperial operations for centuries. The construction of transport vessels capable of carrying cavalry horses, siege equipment, and supplies for extended operations pushed Roman shipbuilding capabilities to their limits. The vessels, built in Sicilian shipyards using timber imported from southern Italy, incorporated design features borrowed from Carthaginian naval architecture, while maintaining the structural strength necessary for Mediterranean conditions. The coordination of these construction projects, involving thousands of workers and enormous quantities of materials, demonstrated the administrative sophistication that Roman military organisation had achieved. The intelligence network that Scipio established to gather information about North African conditions proved crucial to the expedition's ultimate success. Roman agents operating under the cover of merchant activities systematically mapped Carthaginian defences, identified potential landing sites, and established contact with disaffected elements within the Carthaginian Empire. The information they gathered revealed that Carthaginian control over North Africa was far more tenuous than Roman planners had realised, with numerous Berber tribes chafing under Carthaginian taxation and military conscription. These intelligence reports also identified Massinissa, the Numidian prince who had been displaced by Carthaginian political manoeuvring, as a potential ally whose support could fundamentally alter the balance of power in North Africa. The diplomatic initiatives that preceded the actual invasion demonstrated Scipio's understanding that military success in Africa would require more than tactical superiority on the battlefield. The Numidian tribes, whose cavalry had provided Carthage with its most effective military arm, represented the key to controlling the North African interior. Scipio's agents worked systematically to exploit the tribal rivalries that had been exacerbated by Carthaginian policies, offering Roman support to leaders who felt threatened by Carthaginian expansion or who had been displaced by political changes within the Carthaginian sphere of influence. The figure of Massinissa emerged as the crucial element in Scipio's African strategy. The young Numidian prince, educated in Carthaginian schools and trained in Mediterranean military techniques, possessed both the traditional authority necessary to command tribal loyalty and the sophisticated understanding of warfare required for operations against Carthaginian forces. His displacement from power by Syphax, a rival Numidian king who had allied with Carthage, created the personal motivation that Scipio needed to secure his cooperation. The promise of Roman support for Massinissa's restoration, combined with guarantees of territorial expansion at Carthaginian expense, provided the foundation for an alliance that would prove decisive in the coming campaigns. The actual landing of Roman forces in North Africa in 204 BCE proceeded with the precision and coordination that characterized Scipio's military operations. The Roman fleet, numbering over 400 vessels of various sizes, approached the African coast near the city of Utica under cover of darkness to minimize the risk of Carthaginian naval interception. The landing sites, selected based on intelligence reports and reconnaissance missions, offered protected beaches where troops and equipment could be disembarked while maintaining security against enemy counterattacks. The speed and efficiency of the landing operations reflected months of preparation and rehearsal that had transformed Roman amphibious capabilities. The Roman army that established itself on African soil numbered approximately 30,000 men, including both legionary infantry and auxiliary forces recruited from Sicily and other Roman territories. The composition of this force reflected Scipio's understanding of the tactical requirements for African operations, with increased emphasis on cavalry and light infantry units that could operate effectively in the open terrain that characterized much of North Africa. The heavy infantry that formed the army's core retained the traditional Roman emphasis on discipline and formation fighting, but their training had been modified to accommodate the more fluid tactical situations that Scipio anticipated encountering. The immediate Carthaginian response to the Roman landing revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their defensive preparations. The Carthaginian government, despite intelligence reports of Roman preparations in Sicily, had not adequately prepared for the scale and sophistication of Scipio's invasion. The local forces available to contest the Roman landing consisted primarily of hastily assembled militias and garrison troops who lacked the training and equipment necessary to confront veteran Roman legions. The absence of significant Carthaginian naval forces in the immediate area allowed the Romans to establish their beachhead without the naval combat that might have disrupted their carefully planned operations. The siege of Utica that followed the Roman landing demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of Scipio's expeditionary force. The city, serving as a major Carthaginian stronghold and naval base, possessed formidable defences that had been strengthened in anticipation of Roman attack. The walls, constructed from local stone and reinforced with earth and timber, rose to heights that made direct assault extremely difficult. The harbour, protected by a chain and defended by artillery positions, could not be easily captured by naval forces. The Roman siege operations, while conducted with characteristic efficiency, revealed that Scipio's force lacked the heavy equipment and numerical superiority necessary for rapid success against major fortified positions. The arrival of Massinissa with his Numidian cavalry fundamentally altered the strategic situation in North Africa and provided Scipio with the mobile striking force that Roman armies had traditionally lacked. The Numidian horsemen, numbering approximately 4,000 riders, brought tactical capabilities that complemented Roman strengths while compensating for traditional weaknesses. Their intimate knowledge of North African terrain, combined with their unmatched skills in reconnaissance and harassment operations, gave the Roman army unprecedented mobility and intelligence-gathering capabilities. The psychological impact of Massinissa's defection from the Carthaginian cause reverberated throughout North Africa, encouraging other tribal leaders to reconsider their loyalties and creating uncertainty about Carthaginian ability to maintain control over their territories. The integration of Numidian cavalry into Roman tactical formations required significant adaptations in command and control procedures. The traditional Roman emphasis on close-order formations and coordinated movements had to be modified to accommodate the more fluid operational style of the Numidian horsemen. Scipio's solution involved creating a hybrid system that maintained Roman discipline and organisation, while allowing sufficient flexibility for the cavalry to exploit tactical opportunities as they developed. This integration process, while challenging in its initial phases, ultimately created a combined arms capability that proved devastatingly effective against Carthaginian forces. The campaign against Syphax and his Carthaginian allies demonstrated the effectiveness of this Roman-Numidian cooperation. Syphax, commanding a force that included both Numidian cavalry and Carthaginian infantry, occupied a strong position in the interior that threatened Roman communications and supply lines. The traditional Roman approach would have involved a direct assault on this position, accepting heavy casualties in exchange for rapid resolution. Scipio's innovative tactics, incorporating Numidian mobility and knowledge of local conditions, enabled a more sophisticated approach that achieved decisive results with minimal Roman losses. The night attack on the camps of Syphax and Hasdrubal Gisco at the Great Plains represented the culmination of Scipio's tactical innovations and his mastery of combined arms warfare. The operation, conducted in the spring of 203 BCE, required precise coordination between Roman infantry, Numidian cavalry, and specialized assault troops trained in night operations. The intelligence that made this attack possible came from Numidian sources who provided detailed information about enemy dispositions, guard routines, and the layout of the opposing camps. The Roman ability to process this information and develop effective tactical plans demonstrated the sophisticated staff work that had evolved during years of complex military operations. The execution of the night attack revealed the professional competence that Roman forces had achieved under Scipio's command. The assault troops, moving in complete silence across difficult terrain, approached the enemy camps without detection despite the presence of Numidian sentries who were supposedly expert in detecting movement across open ground. The coordination of multiple assault columns, each assigned specific objectives within the enemy camps, required communication and timing that reflected extensive preparation and rehearsal. The use of fire as both a tactical weapon and a psychological tool created confusion and panic among the defenders that prevented organised resistance. The destruction of Syphax's army and the capture of the Numidian king himself eliminated the primary threat to Roman operations in North Africa, while simultaneously demonstrating the futility of opposing Roman power. The psychological impact of this victory extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, as tribal leaders throughout North Africa witnessed the complete defeat of a ruler who had been considered one of the most powerful figures in the region. The distribution of Syphax's territories among Roman allies, particularly Massinissa, created a new political structure in North Africa that would support Roman interests for generations. The Carthaginian response to these disasters revealed the desperation that had gripped the city's leadership as they faced the collapse of their North African empire. The decision to recall Hannibal from Italy, where he had maintained his forces for 16 years, represented an acknowledgement that the war's outcome would be determined in Africa rather than through continued operations in Italy. The message that summoned Hannibal home, reportedly stating that Carthage itself was under siege, reflected the psychological impact of Scipio's victories and the recognition that only their greatest general could potentially save the situation. The evacuation of Hannibal's army from Italy proceeded with the same professional competence that had characterized his entire Italian campaign. The Carthaginian forces, numbering approximately 20,000 men after years of attrition, represented the survivors of one of the most remarkable military enterprises in ancient history. These veterans, hardened by constant warfare and bound together by shared experiences that no other soldiers could understand, retained their effectiveness despite the strategic hopelessness of their situation. Their withdrawal from the Italian territories they had occupied for so long marked the end of an era in ancient warfare and the beginning of the final phase of the Second Punic War. The preparations for the climactic confrontation between Scipio and Hannibal involved both commanders in careful analysis of their respective strengths and weaknesses. Scipio's army, reinforced by additional troops from Sicily and supported by Massinissa's growing Numidian forces, numbered approximately 35,000 men and represented the culmination of Roman military evolution during the Punic Wars. The force combined traditional Roman organizational strengths with tactical innovations developed through years of combat against Carthaginian forces. The soldiers, many of whom were veterans of multiple campaigns, possessed the confidence and experience necessary for confronting even Hannibal's legendary tactical abilities. Hannibal's army, assembled from the survivors of his Italian campaign and reinforced by fresh recruits from Carthaginian territories, faced the challenge of integrating diverse elements into an effective fighting force. The veterans of the Alpine crossing, while few in number, provided a core of experienced soldiers whose loyalty to their commander was absolute. The newer recruits, including Carthaginian citizens pressed into military service and allied troops from various North African tribes, lacked the cohesion and experience that had characterized Hannibal's earlier armies. The integration of these diverse elements, while reflecting Hannibal's continued tactical brilliance, could not overcome the fundamental disadvantages created by years of strategic isolation and resource constraints. The Battle of Zama, fought in October 202 BCE, brought together the two greatest military commanders of the ancient world in a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean. The battlefield, located in the interior of North Africa, approximately 5 days' march southwest of Carthage, offered the open terrain that both commanders preferred for major engagements. The relatively flat ground, broken by low hills and scattered vegetation, provided opportunities for the cavalry operations that both sides recognized would be crucial to the battle's outcome. The strategic importance of the engagement was understood by both armies, as defeat for either side would likely result in the complete collapse of their respective war efforts. The tactical deployments that preceded the battle reflected the evolution of military doctrine that had occurred during the long years of the Punic Wars. Scipio's formation incorporated the lessons learned from previous encounters with Carthaginian forces, particularly the importance of maintaining tactical flexibility while exploiting Roman advantages in discipline and organization. The Roman legions, arranged in the traditional three-line formation, were positioned to absorb the initial Carthaginian assault while maintaining reserves for exploitation of tactical opportunities. The positioning of Massinissa's Numidian cavalry on the Roman right flank reflected Scipio's understanding that cavalry superiority would be essential for achieving decisive victory. Hannibal's tactical plan demonstrated his continued mastery of battlefield innovation, despite the constraints imposed by his army's composition. The deployment of war elephants as the initial assault force reflected both the psychological impact these animals could have on enemy troops and the practical necessity of using every available advantage against superior Roman numbers. The positioning of his diverse infantry forces in depth, with the least reliable troops in front and his veterans held in reserve, showed his understanding of his army's limitations, while maximising its potential effectiveness. The placement of Carthaginian cavalry on both flanks, while numerically inferior to the Roman mounted forces, reflected his hope that superior tactical skill might overcome numerical disadvantages. The opening phase of the battle saw the Carthaginian war elephants, numbering approximately 80 animals, advance against the Roman lines in a charge designed to break Roman formation and create opportunities for the following infantry assault. The Roman response to this attack demonstrated the tactical sophistication that their forces had developed through years of combat experience. Rather than meeting the elephant charge with solid formations that might be disrupted by the animal's impact, the Romans created corridors through their lines that allowed the elephants to pass through without causing significant casualties. The combination of disciplined movement and effective use of missile weapons neutralized the elephant threat, while maintaining Roman tactical integrity. The cavalry engagement that developed simultaneously on both flanks proved decisive for the battle's ultimate outcome. Massinissa's Numidian horsemen, fighting on familiar terrain and motivated by their desire to secure their tribal territories, proved superior to their Carthaginian counterparts in both individual combat and tactical coordination. The Roman cavalry, while less numerous than their Numidian allies, provided the disciplined support necessary to exploit the advantages created by Numidian mobility and local knowledge. The gradual defeat of the Carthaginian cavalry left Hannibal's infantry vulnerable to envelopment and eliminated any possibility of tactical surprise or manoeuvre. The infantry engagement that formed the battle's central phase demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred in both armies during the long years of warfare. The Roman legions, advancing in their traditional formation but with modifications developed through combat experience, met the Carthaginian infantry in a series of engagements that tested the discipline and training of both forces. The initial Carthaginian line, composed primarily of hastily recruited troops, gave way under Roman pressure, but the second line of Libyan and Carthaginian infantry offered more determined resistance. The fighting in this phase was characterized by the close-quarters combat that defined ancient warfare, with individual skill and unit cohesion determining local outcomes. The climactic moment of the battle came when Hannibal committed his veteran reserve, the survivors of his Italian campaigns, in a final attempt to break the Roman lines. These troops, representing the last remnant of the army that had crossed the Alps 16 years earlier, advanced with the desperate courage of men who understood that defeat meant the end of their cause. Their assault, conducted with the tactical skill and determination that had made them legendary throughout the Mediterranean world, created the most dangerous moment for Roman forces during the entire engagement. The Roman response, requiring every element of their tactical training and organizational discipline, ultimately contained this final Carthaginian effort, while inflicting casualties that eliminated Hannibal's last reserves. The collapse of Carthaginian resistance following the defeat of Hannibal's veterans was sudden and complete. The remaining Carthaginian forces, seeing their elite troops defeated and their flanks threatened by returning Roman cavalry, abandoned their positions and fled the battlefield. The Roman pursuit, conducted with the systematic efficiency that characterized their military operations, transformed tactical victory into strategic triumph by eliminating the organized Carthaginian forces that might have continued resistance. The casualties inflicted during this pursuit phase ensured that Carthage would lack the military resources necessary to continue the war. The aftermath of Zama demonstrated the decisiveness that could be achieved through the combination of tactical superiority and strategic positioning. Hannibal's escape from the battlefield while preserving his personal survival could not alter the fundamental reality that Carthaginian military power had been broken beyond repair. The Roman victory, achieved through the synthesis of traditional Roman military virtues with innovative tactical approaches, established the foundation for Roman domination of the Mediterranean world. The battle's outcome vindicated Scipio's strategic vision, while demonstrating the effectiveness of Roman military evolution during the crucible of the Punic Wars. The Treaty of Zama, signed in 201 BCE following Hannibal's decisive defeat, imposed conditions upon Carthage that were designed not merely to end the immediate conflict, but to permanently cripple the city's ability to challenge Roman supremacy in the Mediterranean. The terms negotiated by Scipio Africanus, as he would now be known, reflected both Roman pragmatism and their understanding that Carthage's commercial and military capabilities had made them such formidable opponents. The territorial provisions stripped Carthage of all overseas possessions, confining the once mighty maritime empire to a narrow band of North African territory extending roughly 50 miles inland from the coast between the cities of Tabraca and Tacarpe. This dramatic reduction eliminated Carthaginian control over the strategic islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, while also severing their connections to the mineral wealth of Spain that had funded their war effort. The military restrictions imposed by the treaty were equally comprehensive and humiliating. Carthage was forbidden from maintaining war elephants, the exotic weapons that had terrorized Roman armies from Trebia to Zama. Their navy, once the master of Mediterranean sea lanes, was reduced to a mere 10 triremes intended solely for coastal defence and the suppression of piracy. The construction of the new warships required explicit Roman permission, effectively ending Carthage's ability to project power beyond their immediate shores. Perhaps most significantly, Carthage was prohibited from waging war against any enemy, including attacks on African tribes, without Roman consent. This clause would prove particularly problematic in the coming decades, as it left Carthage defenceless against the territorial ambitions of their Numidian neighbours. The financial burden imposed by the treaty was staggering in its scope and duration. The indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver to be paid over 50 years represented approximately 200 tons of precious metal that would flow annually from Carthaginian coffers to Roman treasuries. To put this sum in perspective, it exceeded the entire annual revenue of most Mediterranean states and would consume a substantial portion of Carthaginian commercial profits for 2 generations. The Romans also demanded the immediate payment of additional sums to cover the costs of maintaining Roman armies in Africa during the peace negotiations, further straining Carthaginian resources during the crucial period of post-war reconstruction. The human cost of the treaty extended beyond mere financial obligations. Carthage was required to surrender all Roman prisoners and deserters, many of whom had served in Hannibal's armies for years and had developed personal relationships with their Carthaginian comrades. The fate of these men, who faced execution or enslavement upon their return to Roman custody, served as a grim reminder of the consequences of opposing Roman power. Additionally, Carthage was obligated to provide 100 hostages, chosen from among the sons of their most prominent families, who would be held in Rome as guarantees of Carthaginian compliance with the treaty terms. Despite these crushing restrictions, Carthage's recovery during the decades following Zama proved remarkably swift and comprehensive, a testament to the commercial acumen and entrepreneurial spirit that had originally built their empire. The city's merchants, freed from the enormous costs of maintaining military forces and overseas territories, redirected their energies toward trade and manufacturing with renewed vigour. The workshops of Carthage, no longer required to produce weapons and military equipment, began turning out luxury goods, textiles and metalwork that found ready markets throughout the Mediterranean. The famous Carthaginian purple dye, extracted from murex shells gathered along the North African coast, became more sought after than ever as Roman aristocrats competed to display their wealth through expensive clothing. The agricultural potential of Carthage's remaining territories proved far greater than many had anticipated. The fertile plains of the Bagradas River Valley, no longer subject to the devastation of military campaigns, were systematically developed using advanced irrigation techniques and crop rotation methods that had been perfected during centuries of Carthaginian rule. The introduction of new crops, including improved varieties of wheat and barley obtained through trade with Egyptian merchants, increased agricultural productivity to levels that not only fed the growing urban population, but also generated substantial surpluses for export. The olive groves that covered the hillsides around Carthage produced oil of exceptional quality that commanded premium prices in Roman markets, while the vineyards established in suitable microclimates yielded wines that competed successfully with traditional Greek and Italian vintages. The reconstruction of Carthage's commercial networks proceeded with systematic efficiency that impressed even hostile Roman observers. Carthaginian merchants, operating with smaller but more efficient vessels than their pre-war fleets, established trading relationships that extended from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the bustling markets of Alexandria. The city's harbour, rebuilt and expanded using the latest engineering techniques, could accommodate hundreds of merchant vessels simultaneously, while providing secure storage for the diverse cargoes that flowed through the port. The famous circular military harbour, now empty of warships, was converted into additional commercial facilities that handled the growing volume of trade. The demographic recovery of Carthage proved equally impressive, as the city's population swelled with immigrants drawn by economic opportunities and refugees from the devastated territories of the former empire. Skilled craftsmen from Sicily and Sardinia, displaced by Roman occupation, brought their expertise to Carthaginian workshops where they adapted their techniques to local materials and markets. Spanish miners, familiar with the extraction and processing of precious metals, established new operations in the Atlas Mountains that, while smaller than the great mines of Iberia, produced sufficient silver and copper to support the city's monetary system. Even former soldiers, veterans of Hannibal's campaigns who had been granted land in the interior, contributed to the recovery by establishing agricultural settlements that extended Carthaginian control over previously marginal territories. The speed and extent of this recovery created growing unease among Roman political leaders who had expected Carthage to remain permanently weakened by the war's devastation. Reports from Roman merchants operating in North Africa described a city that appeared more prosperous than ever, with new construction projects, bustling markets, and a population that showed little sign of the demoralization that typically followed military defeat. The harbour installations, while technically limited to commercial use, were built to specifications that could easily accommodate warships if circumstances changed. The workshops that produced luxury goods for export could be rapidly converted to military production, while the agricultural surpluses that fed the growing population could potentially support large armies. Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Elder, emerged as the most vocal advocate for renewed action against Carthage during the 160 BCE. His background as a successful military commander, combined with his reputation for incorruptible moral character and fierce devotion to Roman interests, gave particular weight to his warnings about the Carthaginian resurgence. Cato's famous inspection tour of North Africa in 153 BCE, conducted as part of a Roman diplomatic mission to mediate disputes between Carthage and Massinissa, provided him with first-hand evidence of Carthaginian recovery that he would use to devastating effect in subsequent Senate debates. The figs that Cato dramatically produced during his Senate speeches, allegedly picked fresh from trees outside Carthage just days earlier, served as a powerful symbol of how close the supposedly defeated enemy remained to Roman territories. The fruit's perfect condition demonstrated that Carthage was merely 3 days sailing from Roman shores, while its abundance suggested agricultural prosperity that could support renewed military ambitions. Cato's theatrical gesture, while perhaps calculated for maximum political impact, reflected genuine strategic concerns about the implications of Carthaginian recovery for Roman security. The phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed," became Cato's signature conclusion to every speech he delivered in the Senate, regardless of the ostensible topic under discussion. This rhetorical device, while seemingly obsessive to modern observers, reflected a sophisticated understanding of political psychology and the power of repetition in shaping public opinion. Each iteration of the phrase reinforced the message that Carthage represented an existential threat to Roman civilization that could only be eliminated through the complete destruction of the city and its people. The consistency of this message, delivered by one of Rome's most respected elder statesmen, gradually shifted Senate opinion toward acceptance of the necessity for renewed conflict. The rise of Massinissa's Numidian kingdom provided both the immediate pretext for Roman intervention and the long-term strategic framework that would justify the final destruction of Carthage. The Numidian king, installed in power through Roman support and maintained by Roman protection, had systematically expanded his territories at Carthaginian expense throughout the decades following Zama. His forces, trained in Roman military techniques and equipped with weapons obtained through Roman trade, possessed capabilities that far exceeded those of traditional tribal armies. The disciplined infantry formations that formed the core of Massinissa's forces could operate effectively against Carthaginian militia, while his cavalry retained the mobility and tactical flexibility that had made Numidian horsemen legendary throughout the ancient world. The territorial disputes that provided the legal framework for these expansions typically involved competing claims to marginal lands along the borders between Carthaginian and Numidian territories. The fertility of these disputed regions, enhanced by Carthaginian agricultural techniques and irrigation systems, made them attractive to Numidian settlers who sought to escape the harsh conditions of the interior deserts. Massinissa's legal arguments, while often tenuous by strict historical standards, were consistently supported by Roman arbitrators who viewed Numidian expansion as beneficial to Roman interests in North Africa. The systematic nature of these territorial acquisitions revealed the strategic vision that guided Massinissa's policies throughout his long reign. Rather than seeking dramatic conquests that might provoke Roman concern about Numidian power, he pursued a gradual expansion that steadily reduced Carthaginian territory while increasing his own resources and population. The captured agricultural lands provided food for his growing armies, while the displaced Carthaginian farmers often entered Numidian service as agricultural specialists who improved farming techniques throughout the kingdom. The commercial facilities seized during these expansions, including markets and storage facilities, were integrated into Numidian trade networks that increasingly competed with traditional Carthaginian commerce. The Carthaginian response to these provocations was constrained by the treaty obligations that prohibited independent military action. Each Numidian incursion required Carthaginian officials to petition Rome for permission to defend their territories, a process that often took months to complete and rarely resulted in authorization for effective military response. The Roman Senate, dominated by politicians who viewed Carthaginian weakness as beneficial to Roman interests, typically ruled in favor of Numidian claims or imposed compromise solutions that legitimized Numidian gains while providing minimal compensation to Carthage. The frustration generated by this legal framework gradually eroded the moderate political factions within Carthage that had supported accommodation with Rome. The younger generation of Carthaginian leaders, who had grown up during the period of recovery and prosperity, increasingly questioned the wisdom of accepting permanent subordination to Roman authority. These politicians, while lacking the military experience of their predecessors, possessed the commercial expertise and organizational skills that had rebuilt Carthaginian prosperity. Their growing influence within Carthaginian political circles created pressure for more assertive policies that would protect Carthaginian interests, regardless of Roman approval. The military preparations that accompanied this political shift were necessarily conducted in secret, as open violation of the treaty restrictions would have provided immediate justification for Roman intervention. The reconstruction of Carthaginian military capabilities proceeded through seemingly innocent commercial and civic projects that could be rapidly converted to military use if circumstances required. The expansion of harbour facilities, justified by the growing volume of commercial traffic, created infrastructure that could support naval operations. The establishment of new workshops, ostensibly for civilian production, provided the industrial base necessary for weapons manufacturing. The training programs implemented for urban militia, presented as measures for maintaining public order, developed the military skills that would be essential for defending the city. The recruitment of military personnel followed similar patterns of concealment and gradual preparation. Veterans of Hannibal's campaigns, now aging but still possessing valuable combat experience, were quietly organised into advisory roles that would allow them to train younger men in military techniques. The sons of prominent families, educated in Greek military treatises and trained in athletic competitions that emphasised martial skills, formed a potential officer corps that could provide leadership for larger forces. The immigrant populations that had swelled Carthage's demographics included substantial numbers of men with military experience from various Mediterranean conflicts, providing a reservoir of trained personnel that could be mobilized if necessary. The intelligence networks that monitored these developments provided Roman leaders with detailed information about Carthaginian military preparations, creating a feedback loop that reinforced arguments for preemptive action. The reports submitted by Roman merchants, diplomatic personnel, and allied informants described a city that was systematically preparing for renewed conflict, despite its treaty obligations. The evidence of military training, weapons production, and strategic planning provided concrete justification for the suspicions that had been growing among Roman political leaders throughout the interwar period. The generational change within Roman leadership during the 150 BCE brought to power politicians who had not experienced the trauma of Hannibal's invasion and who viewed Carthaginian recovery as an unacceptable challenge to Roman dominance. These younger senators, influenced by decades of Cato's rhetoric and convinced of Roman military superiority, proved more willing to consider aggressive solutions to the Carthaginian problem. Their confidence in Roman capabilities, reinforced by successful military operations in Greece and Asia Minor, created a political environment that favoured decisive action over continued diplomatic manoeuvring. The economic dimensions of the growing crisis extended beyond simple territorial disputes to encompass broader questions about commercial competition and resource control. Carthaginian merchants, operating with the efficiency and expertise that had originally built their empire, were recapturing market share in sectors that Roman traders had dominated during the immediate post-war period. The superior quality of Carthaginian manufactured goods, combined with competitive pricing made possible by lower labour costs and more efficient production methods, created pressure on Roman commercial interests that translated into political support for anti-Carthaginian policies. The strategic implications of Carthaginian recovery extended throughout the Mediterranean as other peoples observed the apparent revival of Roman adversaries. The Greek cities of the eastern Mediterranean, many of which had been recently conquered by Roman forces, watched carefully for signs that Roman power might be challenged successfully. The Gallic tribes of southern France, still resentful of Roman expansion into their territories, maintained diplomatic contacts with Carthaginian representatives who encouraged hopes of future cooperation against their common enemy. Even within Italy itself, the memory of Hannibal's victories and the support he'd received from some Italian communities created concerns about the loyalty of populations that had been forcibly integrated into the Roman Confederation. The naval implications of Carthaginian recovery proved particularly troubling to Roman strategic planners who understood the importance of maritime control for maintaining their expanding empire. The commercial vessels that filled Carthaginian harbours, while technically civilian in nature, possessed the speed and cargo capacity that would make them valuable for military transport if converted to wartime use. The skilled sailors who operated these vessels retained the seamanship and navigation expertise that had made Carthaginian naval forces so formidable during previous conflicts. The harbour facilities themselves, expanded and modernised during the recovery period, could support naval operations on a scale that would threaten Roman control over crucial sea lanes. The diplomatic manoeuvring that preceded the final crisis reflected the complex web of alliances and obligations that had developed throughout the Mediterranean during the interwar period. Massiniss's relationship with Rome, while formerly that of a client king, had evolved into something approaching partnership as his military capabilities and territorial expansion served Roman interests in North Africa. The Numidian king's advanced age, and the succession disputes that were beginning to emerge within his kingdom, created additional pressures for resolving the Carthaginian situation before political changes might alter the regional balance of power. The internal dynamics of Carthaginian politics during the final years of the interwar period revealed the tensions between those who favoured continued accommodation with Rome and those who advocated for more assertive policies. The commercial classes, whose prosperity depended on peaceful trade relationships, generally supported moderate policies that would avoid provoking Roman intervention. The younger political leaders, frustrated by decades of subordination and confident in Carthaginian capabilities, increasingly favoured policies that would restore their city's independence and dignity. The military veterans and their supporters, while few in number, possessed the expertise and determination that would be essential for any attempt to resist Roman pressure. The cascade of events that would ultimately trigger the Third Punic War was already gaining momentum by the late 150 SBCE as the various pressures and tensions of the interwar period approached their inevitable resolution. The remarkable recovery of Carthaginian prosperity, rather than satisfying Roman concerns about their former enemy, had instead created new anxieties about the potential for renewed conflict. The systematic expansion of Numidian territory, encouraged by Roman support and justified by Roman arbitration, had reduced Carthaginian territory to the point where further losses would threaten the city's survival. The generational change in Roman leadership had brought to power politicians who viewed the Carthaginian problem as requiring permanent solution rather than continued management. The manufactured crisis that would provide Rome with its long-sought pretext for the final destruction of Carthage began to unfold in 151 BCE, when Massinissa launched yet another territorial incursion into Carthaginian lands. This particular aggression differed from previous Numidian expansions in both its scale and its strategic implications. The Numidian king, now approaching his 90th year but still possessed of remarkable energy and ambition, had assembled the largest army of his long reign to seize the fertile territories around the cities of Oroscopa and Hippo Dioritis. These regions, with their extensive olive groves and grain fields, represented some of the most productive agricultural land remaining under Carthaginian control. The Carthaginian response to this latest provocation revealed the transformation that had occurred within their political leadership during the preceding decades. Rather than immediately petitioning Rome for arbitration as they had done in previous disputes, the Carthaginian Senate voted to mobilize their own military forces and resist the Numidian invasion through direct action. This decision, while technically a violation of the Treaty of Zama's restrictions on independent military action, reflected the growing frustration among Carthaginian leaders with the legal framework that had systematically favoured their enemies for over half a century. The army that Carthage assembled for this defensive campaign numbered approximately 25,000 men and represented the culmination of the secret military preparations that had been conducted throughout the interwar period. The infantry corps consisted of citizens who had received training in the urban militia programs, supplemented by mercenaries recruited from the Berber tribes of the interior, who had their own grievances against Numidian expansion. The cavalry, while smaller than the mounted forces that Massinissa could deploy, included experienced riders who had maintained their skills through hunting and tribal warfare. The equipment that armed these forces, while not matching the standardized quality of Roman gear, demonstrated the industrial capabilities that Carthaginian workshops had preserved despite the treaty restrictions. The initial engagements between Carthaginian and Numidian forces proceeded with mixed results that reflected the military evolution both sides had undergone during the decades of peace. The Carthaginian infantry, fighting in formations adapted from Roman tactical manuals, proved capable of meeting Numidian foot soldiers on equal terms in direct combat. However, the superior mobility and coordination of Massiniss's cavalry created tactical advantages that the Carthaginians struggled to counter. The Numidian horsemen, operating with the tactical sophistication that had made them valuable allies to Rome, could concentrate their forces at decisive points, while avoiding the set-piece battles that might have favoured Carthaginian infantry. The decisive engagement of this brief campaign occurred near the town of Oroscopa, where the Carthaginian army found itself surrounded by superior Numidian forces and cut off from their supply lines. The battle that followed demonstrated both the courage of the Carthaginian soldiers and the tactical superiority that Massiniss's forces had achieved through decades of Roman training and support. The Carthaginian infantry, despite fighting with desperate determination, could not overcome the disadvantages created by Numidian cavalry dominance and the superior coordination of enemy forces. The defeat was comprehensive, with most of the Carthaginian army either killed or captured, while the survivors fled back to their territories in complete disarray. The aftermath of this military disaster provided Rome with the legal justification that their leaders had been seeking for renewed intervention in North African affairs. The Carthaginian violation of treaty obligations, combined with reports of military preparations that suggested broader aggressive intentions, created a compelling case for Roman action to restore regional stability. The Senate's response was swift and decisive, with the consul Marcus Manilius receiving authorization to assemble an expeditionary force for operations against Carthage. The legal framework for this intervention was carefully constructed to emphasize Roman obligations to maintain peace and protect their allies, while the underlying strategic objectives remained focused on the permanent elimination of Carthaginian power. The Roman ultimatum delivered to Carthage in 149 BCE revealed the true scope of their intentions and the impossibility of any negotiated settlement that would preserve Carthaginian independence. The initial demands appeared reasonable on their surface. Carthage must provide 300 hostages from among the sons of their leading families, surrender all weapons and military equipment, and submit to Roman authority in all matters of foreign policy. These conditions, while harsh, might have been acceptable to a city that had already endured decades of subordination and restriction. However, the final demand delivered by the Roman commissioners after the hostages had been handed over and the weapons surrendered revealed the true nature of Roman intentions. The requirement that Carthage abandon their city and relocate to a new site at least 10 miles from the sea represented nothing less than a death sentence for a civilization that had been built on maritime commerce for over 6 centuries. The Romans understood perfectly well that Carthage without access to the sea would cease to exist as a meaningful political or economic entity. The workshops that produced goods for Mediterranean markets, the merchants who operated trading networks throughout the known world, and the sailors who possessed the skills necessary for long-distance navigation would all become irrelevant in an inland settlement. The demand was clearly designed to be rejected, providing Rome with the justification for the complete destruction they had already decided to pursue. The Carthaginian response to this impossible ultimatum demonstrated the courage and determination that had sustained their civilization through centuries of Mediterranean competition. The popular assembly that convened to consider the Roman demands erupted in fury when the full implications of the relocation requirement became clear. Citizens who had spent decades rebuilding their city, merchants who had invested their fortunes in harbour facilities and commercial infrastructure, and craftsmen whose workshops represented generations of accumulated expertise, all recognised that compliance would mean the end of everything they had worked to preserve. The vote to resist Roman demands was unanimous, marking the beginning of the final phase of the struggle between these two great Mediterranean powers. The military preparations that followed this decision revealed both the strengths and limitations of Carthaginian capabilities after decades of enforced disarmament. The weapons that had been surrendered to Roman commissioners represented only a fraction of the military equipment that had been hidden throughout the city during the preceding years. The workshops that had ostensibly produced only civilian goods were rapidly converted to military production, turning out spears, swords, and armour with efficiency that surprised even Roman observers. The harbour facilities that had been expanded for commercial purposes were hastily adapted to support the construction of warships, using timber that had been stockpiled under the pretense of civilian construction projects. The recruitment of military personnel proceeded with desperate urgency, as Carthaginian leaders recognized that they would soon face the full might of Roman military power. The citizen militia that had received training during the interwar period formed the core of the defensive forces, while appeals went out to allied tribes and mercenary companies throughout North Africa. The response to these recruitment efforts demonstrated the continued appeal of Carthaginian leadership among peoples who had their own reasons for opposing Roman expansion. Berber warriors from the Atlas Mountains, veterans of conflicts with Roman client states, arrived in substantial numbers to join the defence of the city that had long served as the centre of North African resistance to foreign domination. The Roman army that landed in North Africa in 149 BCE, under the command of Consul Manius Manilius, numbered approximately 84,000 men and represented one of the largest expeditionary forces that Rome had ever assembled. The 4 legions that formed the army's core were composed of experienced soldiers who had served in the recent campaigns in Greece and Asia Minor, while the Allied contingents included troops from throughout the Roman Confederation who brought diverse skills and experience to the operation. The equipment that armed these forces reflected the standardization and quality control that had made Roman armies feared throughout the Mediterranean, while the logistical support systems demonstrated the administrative sophistication that enabled Rome to sustain complex military operations across vast distances. The initial Roman approach to Carthage revealed both the confidence and the tactical limitations that characterized their military doctrine. The Roman commanders, expecting to face a demoralized population that would quickly surrender when confronted with overwhelming force, had not prepared for the systematic resistance that the Carthaginians were organizing. The siege lines that the Romans established around the city, while following established patterns that had proven successful in previous operations, failed to account for the extensive defensive preparations that the Carthaginians had been conducting in secret. The result was a military stalemate that would persist for 3 years and cost both sides enormous casualties. The defensive works that protected Carthage represented the culmination of centuries of military engineering experience adapted to the specific challenges of resisting Roman siege techniques. The city's walls, originally constructed during the period of Carthaginian expansion and subsequently reinforced during the interwar period, incorporated the latest developments in defensive architecture. The massive stone blocks that formed the foundation were fitted together with precision that eliminated weak points where Roman siege engines might concentrate their efforts. The height of the walls, exceeding 40 feet in most sections, made direct assault extremely difficult while providing defenders with commanding fields of fire against approaching attackers. The harbour defences that protected Carthage's seaward approaches demonstrated the ingenuity and determination that characterized the city's resistance. The famous circular military harbour, empty of warships for decades, had been converted into a fortified position bristling with artillery engines and defensive works. The commercial harbour, with its extensive quays and storage facilities, was protected by a massive chain that could be raised to block enemy vessels, while the approaches were mined with underwater obstacles designed to damage Roman ships. The construction of these defences, accomplished in the months following the Roman ultimatum, required the mobilization of the entire civilian population and demonstrated the unity of purpose that had emerged within Carthaginian society. The siege operations that characterized the first 2 years of the war reveal the evolution of Roman military engineering and their systematic approach to reducing fortified positions. The Roman siege works, constructed according to techniques perfected during previous campaigns, included multiple lines of circumvallation that completely surrounded the city and prevented any possibility of relief or resupply. These fortifications, built from timber and earth reinforced with stone where available, stretched for miles around Carthage's perimeter and required constant maintenance by thousands of Roman soldiers and allied auxiliaries. The scale of these operations demonstrated the resources that Rome was willing to commit to achieving the complete destruction of their ancient enemy. The artillery bombardment that accompanied the siege operations employed the most advanced siege engines available to Roman military engineers. The massive catapults, constructed from timber imported from Italy and equipped with torsion mechanisms that could hurl stone projectiles weighing over 100 pounds, systematically targeted specific sections of the Carthaginian walls. The accuracy of these weapons, improved through months of practice and adjustment, allowed Roman gunners to create breaches in the defensive works while minimizing the exposure of their own forces to enemy fire. The psychological impact of this constant bombardment, combined with the physical damage inflicted on the city's infrastructure, created conditions that would have broken the morale of less determined defenders. The Carthaginian response to the Roman siege demonstrated both the tactical innovation and the desperate courage that characterized their final resistance. The defenders employed every available technique to counter Roman siege operations, including the use of fire ships against Roman naval forces and sorties designed to destroy enemy siege equipment. The civilian population, including women and children, participated in the defence by carrying supplies to the walls, maintaining defensive works, and assisting in the repair of battle damage. The workshops within the city, operating under constant bombardment, continued to produce weapons and ammunition, while the remaining food supplies were rationed with strict efficiency. The stalemate that developed during the siege's first 2 years reflected both the strength of Carthaginian defences and the limitations of Roman siege techniques when applied against a determined and well-prepared enemy. The Roman forces, despite their numerical superiority and advanced equipment, found themselves unable to achieve the rapid victory that their commanders had anticipated. The casualties inflicted by Carthaginian defenders during repeated assault attempts created morale problems among Roman troops who had expected an easy conquest. The logistical challenges of maintaining such a large army in the field for an extended period strained Roman resources and created political pressure for a more decisive approach. The appointment of Scipio Aemilianus as consul in 147 BCE marked a turning point in the siege operations and demonstrated the Roman system's ability to adapt to changing military requirements. The young general, adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus and heir to his military reputation, brought to the command both the tactical innovation and the ruthless determination that would be necessary to break the deadlock. His background included extensive experience in siege warfare gained during recent campaigns in Spain, while his family connections provided him with the political support necessary for implementing the harsh measures that complete victory would require. The transformation of Roman siege operations under Scipio Aemilianus reflected both his personal military genius and his understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. Rather than continuing the direct assault tactics that had proven ineffective, he implemented a strategy of systematic strangulation, designed to gradually exhaust Carthaginian resources and morale. The Roman blockade was tightened to prevent any supplies from reaching the city, while the siege works were extended to eliminate every possible avenue of escape or relief. The coordination of these operations required precise planning and execution that demonstrated the professional competence Roman military organisation had achieved. The construction of the Great Mole that blocked Carthage's harbour entrance represented the masterpiece of Roman military engineering during the siege. This massive structure, built from stones quarried from the surrounding countryside and timber imported from Italy, extended across the harbour mouth and effectively sealed the city off from any possibility of naval relief. The engineering challenges involved in constructing such a massive work under enemy fire required innovations in construction techniques and protective measures that would influence Roman military engineering for generations. The psychological impact of this achievement on both attackers and defenders was enormous, as it demonstrated Roman determination to achieve complete victory regardless of the cost. The final assault on Carthage, launched in the spring of 146 BCE, proceeded with the systematic efficiency that characterized Scipio Aemilianus's approach to warfare. The Roman forces, organized into multiple assault columns that could operate independently while maintaining mutual support, advanced against the weakened sections of the Carthaginian defences that had been identified through months of careful observation. The coordination of these attacks, supported by concentrated artillery fire and diversionary operations, created multiple crises that overwhelmed the defenders' ability to respond effectively. The breakthrough that followed years of stalemate came suddenly and decisively as Roman forces poured through the breached walls and began the systematic conquest of the city. The street fighting that characterized the final phase of the siege demonstrated both the desperate courage of the Carthaginian defenders and the professional competence of Roman urban warfare techniques. The narrow streets and multi-storey buildings of Carthage provided defensive advantages that the remaining population exploited with remarkable effectiveness. Every house became a fortress, every intersection a battleground, as civilians joined the remaining soldiers in a final attempt to preserve their city. The Roman response involved the systematic destruction of buildings and the methodical clearing of resistance that reflected their experience in similar urban combat situations throughout the Mediterranean. The destruction of Carthage that followed the city's capture was conducted with deliberate thoroughness that reflected Roman determination to eliminate any possibility of future revival. The systematic demolition of buildings, walls, and infrastructure was carried out by Roman engineers who understood the importance of complete destruction for achieving long-term strategic objectives. The famous burning of the city, while perhaps exaggerated in later accounts, represented the culmination of a process designed to erase Carthaginian civilization from the Mediterranean world. The symbolic ploughing of the city site and the ritual cursing of anyone who might attempt to rebuild demonstrated the religious and cultural dimensions of Roman victory. The fate of the Carthaginian population revealed the harsh realities of ancient warfare and the consequences of resisting Roman power. The survivors of the siege, numbering approximately 50,000 people, were sold into slavery and dispersed throughout the Roman world, where they would serve as permanent reminders of the price of opposing Roman authority. The wealth accumulated during centuries of Mediterranean commerce was systematically looted and transported to Rome, where it would fund the construction projects and public spectacles that celebrated Roman victory. The cultural treasures of Carthage, including libraries, artworks, and religious artifacts, were either destroyed or removed to Roman cities where they would serve as trophies of conquest. The establishment of the Roman province of Africa represented the final phase of the transformation that had begun with Hannibal's invasion of Italy over 60 years earlier. The territorial organisation that emerged from the destruction of Carthage reflected Roman administrative practices that had been developed through decades of imperial expansion. The fertile agricultural lands that had sustained Carthaginian prosperity were distributed among Roman colonists and allied communities, while the strategic positions that had anchored Carthaginian power were occupied by Roman garrisons. The commercial networks that had connected Carthage to markets throughout the Mediterranean were redirected to serve Roman interests, completing the economic transformation that accompanied political conquest. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE marked not merely the end of a city, but the conclusion of a transformative epoch that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western civilization. The psychological impact of witnessing the complete annihilation of a power that had challenged Rome for over a century created a new understanding of Roman capabilities throughout the Mediterranean world. The systematic demolition of Carthage's walls, the methodical destruction of its harbour facilities, and the ritual cursing of its site demonstrated a level of thoroughness that went beyond military necessity to encompass cultural and spiritual obliteration. This act of total warfare established precedents for Roman imperial policy that would influence the treatment of rebellious populations for centuries to come. The transformation of Rome from a regional Italian power to Mediterranean hegemon represented one of the most dramatic geopolitical shifts in ancient history. The confederation system that had enabled Rome to mobilize the resources of the Italian peninsula proved adaptable to the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast distances. The administrative structures developed during the Punic Wars, including the provincial system that organised conquered territories under Roman governors, provided the framework for an empire that would eventually extend from Britain to Mesopotamia. The legal concepts that emerged from the integration of different peoples and cultures during this period established the foundation for Roman law, which would survive the empire itself to influence legal systems throughout the Western world. The military innovations that emerged from the crucible of Punic warfare revolutionized ancient combat and established tactical principles that would dominate European battlefields for centuries. The manipular system, refined through confrontations with Carthaginian tactical flexibility, evolved into the cohort organisation that would carry Roman legions to victory from Gaul to Judea. The integration of diverse auxiliary forces, learned through cooperation with Numidian cavalry and Spanish infantry, created combined arms capabilities that no ancient army could match. The siege techniques perfected during the reduction of Carthaginian strongholds, from the circumvallation of Capua to the harbour blockade at Carthage itself, established Roman military engineering as the standard for systematic warfare. The evolution of Roman naval power during the Punic Wars demonstrated the Republic's remarkable capacity for institutional adaptation and technological innovation. The Corvus device that had enabled Roman victory at Mylae represented more than tactical ingenuity. It embodied the Roman approach to warfare that emphasized turning enemy strengths into weaknesses through systematic analysis and creative response. The massive fleets that Rome constructed during the First Punic War, built by citizens who had never seen the sea, established precedents for the rapid mobilization of resources that would characterize Roman responses to crisis throughout the imperial period. The naval infrastructure developed to support these operations, including the harbour facilities at Ostia and the shipyards throughout southern Italy, created the maritime capabilities that would enable Roman control over Mediterranean trade routes. The economic consequences of the Punic Wars extended far beyond the immediate costs of military operations to encompass fundamental changes in Roman society and culture. The enormous wealth that flowed into Roman coffers from Carthaginian indemnities, Spanish silver mines, and the systematic looting of conquered territories created unprecedented opportunities for both public works and private enrichment. The construction projects that transformed Rome during the 2nd century BCE including the massive basilicas, temples and aqueducts that would define the city's appearance for centuries, were funded largely through the profits of Punic warfare. The private fortunes accumulated by successful commanders and their political supporters established the economic foundation for the competitive luxury that would characterize Roman aristocratic culture. The influx of slaves that accompanied Roman victories created profound social and economic disruptions that would ultimately contribute to the Republic's collapse. The hundreds of thousands of prisoners taken during the Punic Wars, from Carthaginian civilians to Spanish tribesmen, provided the labour force that enabled the expansion of Roman agriculture and manufacturing. The great estates that dominated Italian agriculture by the 1st century BCE were worked primarily by slaves whose ancestors had been captured during the systematic conquest of the Mediterranean. The displacement of free farmers by slave-worked plantations created the urban proletariat that would become a destabilizing force in Roman politics, while the concentration of wealth in the hands of slave-owning elites established patterns of inequality that would persist throughout the imperial period. The cultural transformation that accompanied Roman expansion during the Punic Wars created tensions between traditional Roman values and the cosmopolitan influences that flowed from contact with diverse Mediterranean civilizations. The Greek cultural elements that entered Roman society through conquered cities in Sicily and southern Italy challenged traditional Roman emphasis on practical skills and civic duty. The luxury goods that became available through expanded trade networks created new standards of living that conflicted with the austere values that had sustained Rome during its period of expansion. The philosophical and religious ideas that accompanied cultural contact provided alternatives to traditional Roman beliefs that would ultimately transform the spiritual landscape of the ancient world. The military professionalization that emerged from the prolonged conflicts of the Punic Wars established precedents that would fundamentally alter the relationship between Roman citizens and their state. The volunteer legions that served under Scipio Africanus in Spain and Africa represented a departure from the citizen-soldier model that had characterized early Roman warfare. The extended campaigns required by Mediterranean operations created a class of professional soldiers whose primary loyalty was to their commanders rather than to the state. The land grants and monetary rewards that became necessary to maintain these forces established patterns of military patronage that would ultimately enable ambitious generals to challenge the authority of the Senate itself. The strategic doctrines that emerged from Punic warfare influenced Roman military thinking for generations and established principles that would guide imperial expansion throughout the Mediterranean. The Fabian strategy of attrition, while initially controversial, demonstrated the effectiveness of systematic approaches to warfare that emphasized logistics and resource management over tactical brilliance. The combined arms tactics pioneered by Scipio Africanus, integrating Roman infantry discipline with auxiliary mobility and specialized capabilities, created templates for military organization that would be adapted to diverse geographical and cultural conditions. The siege techniques perfected during the reduction of Carthaginian strongholds established Roman military engineering as the standard for systematic warfare. The diplomatic innovations that accompanied Roman expansion during the Punic Wars created new models for international relations that would influence Mediterranean politics for centuries. The client-king system that emerged from Roman relationships with figures like Massinissa provided mechanisms for indirect control that reduced the administrative burden of governing distant territories. The treaty structures that formalized Roman hegemony over defeated enemies established legal frameworks that legitimized Roman authority, while providing face-saving alternatives to direct annexation. The propaganda techniques that justified Roman actions to both domestic and international audiences created narratives of defensive warfare and civilizing mission that would be repeated throughout the imperial period. The technological developments that emerged from Punic warfare extended beyond military applications to encompass advances in engineering, navigation and manufacturing that would benefit civilian populations throughout the Roman world. The road-building techniques perfected for military logistics created transportation networks that facilitated commercial exchange and cultural communication. The harbour engineering that enabled Roman naval operations established precedents for port construction that would support Mediterranean trade for centuries. The metallurgical advances that improved weapons and armour production contributed to the development of tools and implements that increased agricultural and manufacturing productivity. The administrative systems that evolved during the Punic Wars provided the institutional foundation for governing the vast territories that would comprise the Roman Empire. The provincial system that organised conquered territories under Roman governors established precedents for imperial administration that balanced local autonomy with central control. The legal frameworks that integrated diverse populations under Roman authority created mechanisms for dispute resolution and social organisation that would survive the empire itself. The taxation systems that extracted resources from conquered territories provided the financial foundation for imperial expansion while creating incentives for economic development. The demographic changes that accompanied Roman expansion during the Punic Wars created new patterns of population distribution and cultural interaction that would shape Mediterranean civilization for centuries. The colonization programs that settled Roman citizens in conquered territories established centers of Roman culture that would facilitate the integration of diverse populations. The urbanization that accompanied Roman rule created new opportunities for economic advancement and cultural exchange, while establishing the city-based civilization that would characterize the imperial period. The mobility that resulted from improved transportation and communication networks enabled the movement of people, goods, and ideas that would create the cosmopolitan culture of the Roman world. The religious and philosophical developments that emerged from cultural contact during the Punic Wars established precedents for the spiritual transformation that would ultimately lead to the adoption of Christianity. The mystery religions that entered Roman society through contact with Greek and Oriental cultures provided alternatives to traditional Roman religious practices that emphasized personal salvation and spiritual fulfillment. The philosophical schools that flourished in the cosmopolitan environment of the late Republic offered systematic approaches to ethics and metaphysics that would influence Roman intellectual life for centuries. The syncretistic tendencies that emerged from religious contact created the cultural environment that would enable the spread of monotheistic religions throughout the Roman world. The historiographical traditions that emerged from the Punic Wars established patterns of historical writing that would influence Western literature for centuries. The accounts of Polybius, Livy, and other ancient historians created narrative frameworks that emphasized the moral and political lessons of historical events, while providing detailed descriptions of military and political developments. The biographical traditions that focused on great commanders like Hannibal and Scipio Africanus established models for historical writing that emphasized individual achievement and character development. The analytical approaches that sought to identify the causes and consequences of historical events created methodological precedents that would influence historical scholarship throughout the Western tradition. The economic theories that emerged from analysis of Punic warfare established principles of resource management and strategic planning that would influence military and political thinking for centuries. The understanding of logistics and supply that developed during extended campaigns created appreciation for the economic foundations of military power that would guide imperial policy. The recognition of commercial competition as a source of international conflict established precedents for economic warfare that would influence diplomatic and military strategy. The analysis of taxation and tribute systems that supported military operations created frameworks for understanding the relationship between economic and political power. The constitutional developments that emerged from the challenges of governing an expanding empire established precedents for political organisation that would influence Western government for centuries. The extraordinary commands that enabled figures like Scipio Africanus to conduct extended campaigns created precedents for executive authority that would ultimately contribute to the transformation of the Republic into the Empire. The provincial systems that organised conquered territories under Roman authority established models for imperial administration that balanced central control with local autonomy. The legal frameworks that integrated diverse populations under Roman law created mechanisms for dispute resolution and social organisation that would survive the empire itself. The Punic Wars thus represent far more than a series of military conflicts between two ancient powers. They constituted a transformative epoch that established the foundations of Western civilization as we know it today. The Roman victory ensured that Mediterranean culture would develop along lines that emphasized law, administration, and systematic organization, rather than the commercial and maritime traditions that had characterized Carthaginian civilization. The military innovations, administrative systems, and cultural patterns that emerged from this prolonged conflict would influence human development for over 2 millennia, creating the institutional and intellectual foundations that would enable the rise of European civilization and its eventual global expansion. The lessons of the Punic Wars continue to resonate in contemporary strategic thinking, offering insights into the dynamics of great power competition, the importance of institutional adaptation, and the relationship between a military capability and political authority. The rise and fall of empires, the role of economic competition in international conflict, and the importance of cultural cohesion in maintaining political unity remain relevant concerns that can be illuminated through careful study of this pivotal period in ancient history. The ultimate triumph of Roman systematic organisation over Carthaginian commercial flexibility established patterns of historical development that would shape the trajectory of Western civilization for centuries to come, making the Punic Wars among the most consequential conflicts in human history.